Around 10 years ago, I was living with my mum, dad, and older sister in an oldish house in a very small village. When I say small, I mean its only main feature was a small church and a few scattered houses occupied mostly by very old people. At the time, it was the summer, so I wasn't at school or anything, and since we were so far in the middle of nowhere, I spent most of that time at home, glued to one screen or another. The usual routine was that I'd wake up at around 10 or 11. By this point, Mom, Dad, and sister had all left for work, so I had the house to myself. I'd go downstairs, make toast, watch random stuff on TV for an hour before heading back to my room to continue with whatever game I was grinding through that particular day. The usual habits of a 17-year-old guy cut off from the rest of the world by many, many fields. I should give you a quick rundown of our house. It was an older cottage with 2 rooms upstairs, mine and my sister's, and everything else downstairs. As you walk up the stairs, you got to a very small landing and could go either left to my room or immediate right to my sister's room. Basically, the way this was laid out was that I could sit in my room with the door open, and my sister's room is directly opposite. I should also mention that the ceiling in both our rooms was slanted. We were basically in a large attic where the roof slanted down because of where the slant met the wall, and we had a crawl space that ran the length of the house on either side of the room, both with a small door to access them. These were mostly used for sorting normal attic stuff like Christmas decorations and old forgotten toys. The doors to these were thin little things, about 4 feet tall with a small handle on the outside. This is important because turning these tiny doorknobs opened them, but only from the outside. If the door was pushed shut, with you inside, there was no way back out. I discovered this for myself on more than one occasion. The door on my side ran along my room and along one wall in my sister's room, and hers ran along the other side along mine. This space was not very big. You had to crouch to stand in it, and most of the time you were in there you were crawling on your hands and knees. Anyway, this one morning I'm awoken to a familiar noise, sort of a small creature rustling around in the crawl space on my sister's side. I could hear this because my bed was against the wall that ran along it. Not an unusual noise. Living in the countryside, we had mice almost constantly, and they pretty much had a run of the storage spaces regardless of how many traps we set. I thought nothing of it and got up and went off to begin my morning ritual of toast and TV. The first odd thing I noticed was while watching TV, I could hear movement upstairs. My sister's room was directly above the living room, so I assumed she'd just not gone to work that day for whatever reason and continued munching. Around an hour or 2 later, I went back upstairs and booted up my PC. As I was waiting, I turned around to open my door and faced my sister's closet, and realized it was late in the day, and she had yet to leave the room. An odd thing, since she normally parked up on the sofa in the living room on her days off and didn't move until our parents returned. We're not the most active family. I started to think that perhaps she was at work, and I'd imagined the noise from upstairs. But as I mused this, I noticed the crack of light at the bottom of her door as a shadow passed by it. Okay, so there's definitely someone in there. Must be her, right? I once again pushed it from my mind and went back to my PC. More time passed, and the thought came back to me. Why would she be at home but not leave? She only has a small TV in her room and no books. So what had she been doing in there all day? I glanced back around and saw the shadow under the door. She was still moving around. So what was up? I finally decided to knock on the door. I tried a few times and even said her name but received no answer. Weird. But maybe she had headphones or something on. I knocked a bit harder again and said her name, but no answer again. Alright, I thought, forget this. I'm just gonna go in. So I cracked the door open and peered round. I found an empty room. No one inside at all. Feeling slightly confused, but better that it was just in my imagination, I stepped in properly and looked around and saw something that made me full-on panic. Near the bottom of her little door leading into the crawl space, there was a small hole that the mice had made to get in and out of the bottom. Really small, but just big enough to fit half your hand through. There, coming through that hole, were 4 fingers, holding the door shut from the inside. At first I thought, no, it can't be fingers, don't be stupid, until I watched them slowly creep back through the hole into the crawl space. I lost my crap. Very quietly, might I add. I backed out of the room, shutting the door behind me, and ran to mine. Being the stupid teenager I was, I grabbed what might be the most imposing weapon I could find, the fake Winchester rifle cap gun I got from Disneyland a few years previous. I figured that if whoever was hiding in that bedroom didn't believe it was a real firearm, I could at least hit them with it. I ran off downstairs to where my dogs were on the far side of the house and called my mum, who worked a 5-minute drive away from our house. She told me to stay put, and that her managers were on their way. In this time I made a small upgrade from fake plastic rifle to one of my dad's golf clubs and felt much better with that. Finally my mum and her boss, Johnny, show up, and I tell them everything, leading up to this point. They say okay, and we all set off upstairs to investigate. Me, rather unheroically, being up the rear with my golf club. We get to my sister's room, and I point to the door. I'll never know if my mum is just hard as nails or massively stupid, but while John and I watch, she marches over to the door, yanks it open and sticks her head in. A moment passes while she looks left and right, and John and I are preparing to yank her back from the clutches of the psycho hobo murderer hiding in there before she shouts, "Chris, what are you doing in there? Get out!" Small amount of backstory. Chris was my sister's boyfriend. Unbeknownst to me, the night before, my dad had asked Chris to leave, as he had stayed with us for around 5 days at this point. He said, "Yep, that's cool," and as far as Mum and Dad knew, he headed home. What really happened was instead of leaving, him and my sister had planned to make it seem like he'd left, then he could stay another night. He would then wake up before my mum shouted my sister up for work, like she did every morning, and would hide in the crawl space and sleep there until everyone left for the day. The one small hitch in the plan was that they didn't think of me. They'd forgotten I was home and conveniently sat directly opposite the only exit for most of the day, and as a result he was trapped. When I knocked, he hid himself behind the door and held it shut to prevent being locked in. My mum swiftly told him to get out and not return. Sadly, this was not the last time we saw the guy, as it turned out he'd stolen quite a bit of money from my sister's room while he'd been hiding out there, because my sister makes terrible decisions, got her pregnant, and proceeded to smash windows trying to get at her and the baby around a year later. For a while we lived in the same city, when I went to uni, and he was spending time at the prison there for stabbing someone in a completely different town. Super guy. Oh, and a small topper to all of this. As I mentioned before, the only rooms upstairs are mine and my sister's bedrooms. He'd been there for close to 14 hours with no access to a toilet. But no worry for this guy, because he had a lot of empty bottles to piss in, which he kindly left behind for us to clean up. And finally, about a year later, as Mum was getting the Christmas decorations out, which were as far back in the storage space as you can go, she found a small bag filled with feces. I should mention, where she found it is exactly next to where my bed is on the other side of the wall. The rustling that woke me up that day was him, hiding his feces amongst our tinsel and trees. So to my sister's baby daddy, who hid in our crawl space and used it as a private bathroom. Let's not meet, yeah? I used to see ghosts outside my apartment complex all the time. To give you a bit of context, they would be outside dressed in 50s style clothing. They would be driving up in old cars, go through gates and then vanish into thin air. There were also two guys packing up old pickup with camping gear. They would just be outside and suddenly disappear. I wanted to record it once, but when I got my phone out, they were already gone. I know this is a very convenient thing to say, but it's honestly a true account of what happened. I work for a national airline that mostly operates regional destinations. Mostly, we use single-aisle planes. I'm a flight attendant and usually feel safe being in a cabin full of passengers. But not this day. There are only two galleys on this plane, the front galley and the back galley. The front galley is close to the cockpit, thus it has an installed CCTV for the pilots to monitor activity around the cockpit door. After 9/11, everything had to be installed for extra precaution. During a flight at cruising altitude, the captain called the lead-in flight attendant, asking why they let two little kids play in front of the cockpit door. B-737 is a small plane, with the cockpit door close to the crew's seats. The leading flight attendant, with another crew member sitting at the crew member's seating area, denied any kids playing near the area, as the seats are situated right next to the cockpit door. But the captain insisted he could actually see the two kids, a boy and a girl, playing in front of the door through the CCTV. At this point, the leading flight attendant was not too happy, thinking that their pilots are pulling pranks on them. After quite some time, the captain let it go and told them to never mind. When they touched down and got to the hotel, the captain pulled the leading flight attendant along with his first officer in tow. He insisted to know if the leading flight attendant and her crew really didn't see the two kids playing in front of the cockpit door and the first galley. She maintained they didn't, and said since the galley is so small anyway, like seriously it's less than 10 meters long, only from port side to starboard side door, that consisted of crew seats, the entrance to the cockpit and the galley, she wouldn't miss two kids playing. Both pilots went blank, then said they had both seen the kids playing right next to both flight attendants and wondered why they let them there. The first officer confirmed what his captain had seen, but because it was late, the leading wouldn't want to scare her crew and decided to keep it to herself, only asking the crew that was with her during the incident if they didn't notice any kids, but both maintained they hadn't seen any. Up to this day, no one knows who the two kids were, but both pilots saw them on CCTV. My great-grandma died in '92. My auntie got the phone call that night. The next morning, my then 3-year-old cousin came out of her room and sleepily mentioned, "Mama, Grandma Rose," as in the one who just died, "visited me last night. She said to tell you that her hip doesn't hurt anymore." This happened to me about 4 months back. My family decided to visit some relatives in the city. During our stay there, my brother and I played card games and stayed up late watching movies with our cousins. One night we went to grab some snacks, so me and 2 other cousins went to the kitchen while the rest stayed in the living room. While there, we heard a scream. I heard the scream of another cousin who went to sleep early, but my 2 other cousins heard the scream of a different cousin who also went to sleep early. There are 8 cousins in the house, including my brother and I, and we immediately went to the living room to see the problem. But my brother, who stayed in the living room, didn't hear anything. Even 2 of our other cousins who stayed outside didn't hear a thing. For the rest of the night, we talked about ghost stories, and it turns out the house was actually haunted. In one of the rooms, if you sleep alone, you will wake up at 3 a.m. and won't be able to sleep till 4. The kitchen and balcony are allegedly the 2 ghost hotspots in this house. My dad is a private pilot. He's got a Cessna 172. One time we were flying to this tiny airport owned and run by one guy. We're flying in pattern, waiting to land because there was a plane taking off. The plane didn't make it. I remember my dad describing the air being thin. It took off, started to climb, and then suddenly dropped like a rock. The pilot died on scene. His wife at least made it to the hospital. We didn't find out what happened after that. They were an older couple and the parents of the owner of the airport. They'd been visiting him. He was the only one working comms when it happened. I vividly remember the way the plane dropped, and the smoke and fire, and the trucks and ambulance. The wait to land, and watching the smoke rise, and the awful, broken up communication. It's not something I would ever wish to repeat. My partner and I were sitting in bed. The room is dim but not pitch, and there's a mirror hanging on the closet door to our right. Like if I turn my head, I see myself. We were watching TV when I see something huge and black glide by the mirror, kind of like No-Face from Spirited Away but without the adorable mask. I thought to myself, as paranormal things aren't uncommon for me, okay, just gonna let that one go. Did I even really see that? Am I hallucinating? I didn't say anything out loud, but my partner says, "Did you just see something weird go by the mirror?" And they described exactly what I saw. This happened to me a few months ago. I'm a 24-year-old female student from Germany. The place I live in has quite a diverse population, from American soldiers and their families to immigrants from Arabic heritage. We have everything here, hence why it isn't unusual to be approached by people that aren't very fluent in German. So yesterday I had to skip my online class to get out the house to have my horse's feet done, because the guy who does that wants to put his business on hold due to the second lockdown, and was only willing to do it on my horse when I agreed on an appointment yesterday. That's not really important, but I was out and about yesterday, and wearing clothing that were well suitable for getting dirty. I usually take the train to the place my horse is at, and while there is a stop down the hill close to the apartment I live in, I decided to get some groceries as I was already out, and took the same train line back, but got out on the main station instead of my stop. A friend of mine also lives in the same apartment complex as I do, and I decided to ask her if she needed anything from the store so she wouldn't have to go out this week. So when I finally was done and ready to take the bus back, which usually has a stop right in front of our complex, I was loaded with 2 full bags of groceries and a 6-pack of 1.5-litre water bottles, which is important, as I was really packed. I was making my way to the bus stop when I noticed a group of men that were walking in the distance in front of me. I only noticed them because one of them made a point by aggressively spitting and sneezing onto an e-scooter that was in front of a closed store, and then tried to talk up a girl that was walking in the opposite direction of a group. This was already sending some red flags. Not the first time I encountered a group of idiots like that, so I tried keeping my distance and walking as slowly as possible to not pass them. Yeah, that sounds pretty paranoid and probably is, but trust me when I say that I have my experiences and have been in more uncomfortable situations than I want to admit. The group made their way through the train station, which I had to go through. The one who had spat on the e-scooter suddenly split from the group because apparently a bag he was carrying had ripped and the vodka bottle had just fallen out. He fumbled with it while the others walked on. I had to pass him to not stop like a paranoid ass, so I got on the escalator to exit the train station and get to the bus, when he rushed to get to his group again, and just like that he was suddenly next to me. took on another step towards his group, only to turn around and suddenly hold the ripped bag up to my face. I tried not to acknowledge him, which usually does the trick with such guys, but he wouldn't let it slide. He rambled something about the bag and how it dropped his bottle. Honestly, I could barely understand him as his German was so broken. I couldn't pass him on the escalator, and when I finally got off, I did my best to directly rush to the bus, which was already waiting. He took that as an opportunity to consistently try and get in front of me, successfully preventing me from getting on the bus in time. At this point, I had said nothing to him and didn't even acknowledge him, yet he was still talking to me, standing uncomfortably close. Not just pandemic respect, socially distance uncomfortable, but I can count your nose hairs, please get away from me uncomfortable. And of course he wasn't wearing a mask. He asked my name, something about where I worked, and I couldn't follow because of his bad German. What I might add isn't really the problem here because again, diverse population. We can't expect everyone to speak a language they're just learning, or well, just came into contact with. Heck, my English isn't even that good. Why should I expect a non-native German speaker to do better than I do with other languages? The problem was that he invaded my personal space on top of not respecting the social distance norms. People might say I was rude trying not to acknowledge him in the first place, but that should have been a cue for him to leave. And I'm not ready for conversation. He displayed worrying behavior by spitting and sneezing on the e-scooter and not wearing a mask in public, where it was mandatory, and I really don't want to socialize with someone like that. You guys get me, right? Well, not seeing any opportunity to get rid of him quickly with my bus gone and him particularly glued to my side, I finally spoke. I told him to leave me alone, what he either couldn't understand or simply didn't want to. Either way, he took that as a cue to want to shake my hand, which I declined because A, pandemic, and B, no. He insisted on it, going so far as to try and grab my hand against my will. I repeated my plea for him to leave, which he again ignored, and opted to ask me to take my mask off because he wants to see my pretty face. Of course, I told him I didn't want to do that, and that I wanted to be left alone. I wanted to push him away so badly, but due to me being panicked, that wasn't really an option if I valued the groceries. Despite me being visibly uncomfortable and trying several times to walk away from him, he still didn't take the hint and started to aggressively offer me cigarettes and a bottle of energy drink. He literally wanted me to drink from his already opened bottle. No matter what I did, he followed me, and when I put down one of the 6 packs of water to tighten one of the bags hanging from my shoulder, he started grabbing at it, insisting that he carry it for me. He started a whole ramble about how others from his place, apparently he came from Iraq, all had German friends, but he didn't because everyone over here is a Nazi and just wanted to have German friends to go out for coffee and dinner and teach him the language, all while still trying to grab my bags, which I was holding on for dear life to. Finally, a couple of homeless people came over, as always, and sat at the bus stop, and apparently had noticed what was going on, and called me over and asked about my shirt and where I got it. I gladly took the opportunity to engage with them in the hopes that the creep would leave me alone, but surprise, surprise, he didn't. While I was still trying to talk to other people, he consistently got in front of me, waving his hands around to prevent me from making eye contact with anyone else. He literally jumped between me and others, pressing cigarettes from his opened energy drink in their hands. Everything to prevent them from speaking to me. Not just that, he constantly urged me to get away from them because they all just drink all day, which is no good. Pretty much what he said. I was quite confident at this point his group has left him behind. Well, at least I didn't notice them around anymore. In the end, the couple just couldn't keep up the conversation with me due to the aggressive interruptions from him, and them being, well, a little drunk, left. But they bought me some time, so the next bus would be there in a mere 4 minutes. I still opted to sit on the bench, placing my bags and the 6-pack next to me, so there would be no room for him to sit, in hopes to finally get some distance between him and me. Again, he was up close and personal from the start. He simply took my bags without asking, and not just sat down as close to me as possible, arms and legs touching, but he held onto my bags, stating that he helps me to carry them. I told him that I needed my bags back because my bus was coming soon, to which he replied that he would give me my bags if I gave him my number. He held his pack of cigarettes and a pen up to me, and wanted me to write them on there. Reluctantly, and knowing that he probably wouldn't take no for an answer, I wrote down an old number of mine which I sincerely hope hasn't been given out again. Then he insisted on my name, saying he wants to take me out for dinner tonight at his place, as all restaurants are of course closed due to lockdown, and can't do that if he doesn't know my name. I added a fake name which apparently satisfied him, but he still held onto my bags and started rambling about how badly he wants to take me out for dinner or drinks, and that he likes me, even going so far as to say he loved me, which to be fair just could be a bad translation to German. Despite that, I told him, you don't tell people you love them just like that, which of course he ignored, going on how my looks are so good, blah blah blah. To say I'm conventionally attractive is a lie. I'm slightly overweight, have a shaved side cut, and only wear extra baggy band shirts, and yesterday even muddy track pants. Not quite the get-up that catches people's eye in a positive way. I caught his eye, and now I'm his best friend. Apparently. Anyway, that could be a bad translation. He even ignored my remark about being busy all the time, insisting that today or tomorrow he wants to meet me again. And the while he was literally breathing right in my face, even trying to take down my face mask. The 4 minutes it took for the bus to arrive at the station were the longest 4 minutes of my life. But it finally came, and I aggressively ripped my bags from him and rushed to get in. I nearly even forgot to show my ticket to the driver, but thinking that it would get rid of him, but I was wrong again. He followed me in, trying to insist on paying for my ticket. I'm so very lucky that we get a student ticket at my uni, because otherwise I would have had to tell the driver where I wanted to get one. Again, I might be just a bit paranoid, but I kinda was thinking he was hoping I would reveal the general location of my apartment, or at least give him an indicator of which ticket he needed to buy so he could ride with me. I showed my ticket, and even though he was right behind me, I rushed to the back of the bus, hoping that this would finally get rid of him. But again, the hope was quickly shattered. He insisted to the bus driver that I was his friend, and that he apparently needed to tell me something. He even put on a mask out of nowhere so he could just get on. And he did. He got on the bus without paying, walked where I was seated, and started to beg for my confirmation that I would go out with him to dinner tonight or tomorrow, and that we could even have some drinks. I told him I didn't have time. And then, finally, the bus driver, through the intercom, told him to get off, which luckily he did. I'm sorry for the school kids there who had to witness me loudly swearing, all known religious figures, for finally blessing me with being able to get rid of the guy. He still stood outside the bus and waved at me as we drove off, but I was just so relieved he couldn't follow me anymore. Turns out I forgot my 6-pack of water on the bench. A good part of the eggs were destroyed, and apparently I lost a pack of dry yeast somewhere along the way, which is infuriating, but at the same time I'm just glad he didn't know where I lived. This horror story may not be as drastic or dramatic or horrifying as others, but it's the first time I felt really scared by such an encounter. This man might have just been desperate for having a local friend who could help better his German, but the way he was going about it was just so wrong. I don't know if this is normal in his culture, and frankly, I don't care. Don't get in my personal space when I don't know you, and don't ignore a "leave me alone." You automatically become someone I don't want in my social circle, no matter where you're from. Don't push yourself onto others like that. Gosh. I was on vacation with my parents, where my brother and I were sleeping in the same room together. It was kind of a rural area, where it gets very dark at night. We went to bed in the evening, and we were still talking in the dark about random things. Suddenly I saw a blindingly bright green flash. My brother stopped talking in the middle of his sentence because he saw it too. Both of us were quite startled, and also completely blinded for a few seconds. After confirming that we both saw the same thing, we went to wake up our parents. Unfortunately, there wasn't much to tell them other than there was a weird light. So since we didn't find anything, they just went back to bed, and my brother and I didn't fall asleep too well that night. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened. I thought it could have been the headlight of a car, but we don't remember hearing an engine, and it only happened once over the course of 3 weeks, so that seems unlikely. We still tell this story to people. Sometimes, and usually, they don't believe it, or chalk it up to the wild imagination of children, but we were 15 at the time. It didn't quite make me believe in ghosts, but to us it was a pretty spooky experience. There was a small door that led to the attic space in my bedroom, and it became a habit that I would shut the door as I walked into my bedroom a few times a week. I didn't think anything of it, and just assumed my mum didn't close it all the way when she left it. After a while I made the mistake of joking with her when she made a comment about me not picking up after myself, and I said something like, "Every night I have to close the attic door behind you, how about you shut it all the way when you're done?" She then informed me that she hadn't been in the attic for months. I asked my brother and my father. None of them had. So then I started to pay real close attention to it, making sure it was closed in the morning, checking it after school, and checking after dinner, then heading up to bed. And what do you know? It was open. After a few months of wondering, studying, experimenting, I thought I'd see what happened if I just didn't shut the door. I opened the door before school and checked it after school. Still open. Closed it after dinner. Still open. Before bed, still open. Now, I'm laying in bed, mind going crazy with the open door across the room. I decide to check it out, so I roll over and focus on the black space into the attic. That is when I see a face staring back at me. I bolt downstairs, wake my parents up, get ridiculed by my brother and switch bedrooms with my brother and move into a new house about 6 months later due to an expanding household. And what do you know? My new physics teacher and his wife actually bought our house. I could have forgotten all about the events and chalked it up to me having an overactive imagination. But then, I had discovered in my senior year how awesome our physics teacher was, and it became my favorite class by far and favorite teacher. At the end of senior year, my friend and I took our VHS camcorder around, doing mostly silly things, but then took it to my old house to see what they'd done with the place. We got a very fun tour. I got to tell stories about all the projects my dad did that were still a part of the house. Then the wife led us upstairs and showed us the sewing room. So I jokingly ask, "Notice anything strange about this room?" And her face goes blank. On camera she asks what I mean, and I try to shrug it off but end up saying something about the attic door. She confirmed that every time she comes up to sew, it's open, and then tells us that the second day of being in the house, their dog, a German Shepherd, had got into that room, but would not go back downstairs. He started barking and could not be consoled, then jumped through the window, landing on the tin roof over the porch and running off. The dog did not come back until the next day, and has not stepped foot into the hallway that leads upstairs since. I had the initial thought that I could show my parents and brother the story I had on film, but I decided to just let it be. The attic is the space in the house that runs parallel to the second floor, not above it. I was 11 to 12 when this was going on, so I did not immediately suss it all out. When I told my family that I saw a face, it was just my brother that ridiculed me. My father definitely would have checked for an actual human because of one of the first comments he made was about a family that recently had a coin collection stolen from their house across the street. The event itself was easy to shrug off, because I could have chalked it up to a lot of other possibilities. It wasn't until 5 years later that it became freaky. The look on the wife's face before she told us about the dog was very telling, like something they decided to never put much thought into. Now my story adds depth to their experience, and theirs to mine. This did not make me a believer in the paranormal. I told the story as a collection of details, not a confirmation of ghosts. But what it did do was never make me a non-believer. That face, it was expressionless, dimly lit, through a door smaller than a 2x4, with a knob that had to be turned in order to open it. I wish I still had the VHS. This was from over 25 years ago now, and I moved a lot after high school, and the tape sadly never made it through all those moves. I've always thought ghosts were fake, My mum always got aggressively religious when I'd say something about ghosts in the house. But one time in the summer she went to visit Mexico with her family, and my brother and father were the only ones left at home. I made some macaroni and served my dad a plate, as he asked. I sat on the couch with my brother and watched him play Call of Duty. When my dad came home, he sat down to eat. He said the plate was moving by itself. Of course, me and my brother didn't believe him, as he often exaggerates situations, but he claimed more than once that the plate was moving. Me and my brother denied this, but curiously, after a while, my brother got up to see what he was talking about, and he jumped back and told me that the plate did in fact move. When I got up and saw it moving back and forth along the round table edges, I immediately started praying. My dad called out the names of my brother and uncle, Pat and Reuben, who have passed away recently, and had told us afterwards that, like him, Reuben loved mac and cheese. When the plate stopped moving, I grabbed a knife and started circling the plate. There were no strings attached. I had lifted the plate and there was no water under it either. It couldn't have slipped or had a pressure change that would have moved the plate. I've always doubted religion, but whatever it was moving that plate absolutely dipped after praying. I still don't have enough faith in religion now, but everyone always requests more information whenever I tell them the story that the ghost tried to steal my dad's macaroni. When I was learning to fly, I had a nearly fatal incident that could have gone horribly wrong and would have resulted in certain death. Let me tell you about it. When you land, you have to call what you're going to do. I began calling downwind, and then over the radio, someone else did too, which means we wanted to go down. I'd call base, and he would too. So I was wondering if he was landing on another runway, as we were mirroring these same calls to go down and land. Perhaps there was another one perpendicular to ours, and he was confused with the runway number in use. I kept looking at the other runways, afraid that we would both land and meet where they intersected. We both called final, i.e. we're gonna go down. He was above me in a low wing plane, and we were below with a high wing plane. The perfect disaster. I spotted him 30 feet above us on final, probably 200 to 300 feet up, and the instructor pulled to the right and full throttle. He was quite shaken too, and we didn't talk about it for the rest of the pattern. I asked him if he was okay, and he said he was. I think I ended up saving both our lives that day by just being alert and lucky. Turns out the other dude was doing the mirror pattern as per the booklet. Our runways were right-handed, and he was flying the left-handed pattern. The runway was to be flown right-handed because of dangerous hillsides on the left-hand pattern. So we were both downwind at the time, both base at the same time, just operating on opposite sides. He was flying in a rented plane to do one of his flying exams, and the lesson I learnt that day was the importance of specifying in radio calls right downwind, right base, especially when it's not the standard left turns. I could have died that day, so could the other people. Sometimes I think about it, and how fortunate I am to still be here. I used to work in a bar that wasn't exactly a jail, but temporarily held people awaiting court and sentencing. Everyone had a story about that place, who they called Sebastian. Another thing to note is it used to be a holding jail a long time ago too, but had since been converted into a bar. The first time I saw Sebastian, I looked down the stairs while I was opening, and saw some legs in black pants and smart shoes. The ceiling obscured his torso upwards, and when I went downstairs to ask how he got in, he ran down the hall and vanished. A few other members of staff mentioned seeing a man in a black suit who would be in the bar after hours while you'd be cleaning, but when you'd approach to speak to him, he'd turn the corner and disappear. Sometimes after closing, you'd hear someone ringing the bells on staff members' bikes downstairs, or you'd hear a crash and the bikes would be moved to a different place. Other times you'd see a man in black duck into the office, and by the time you'd enter, he'd be gone. The clincher that convinced us all was that it was just a thing we all believed because we all joked about it so often. One day, the new chef came. They didn't speak much English and would leave once dinner service was over, so they never engaged in the Sebastian stories. One day, one of them asked about a man in black who kept leaning on the ordering window while they were cleaning. Sebastian was pretty chill though. He never scared us or did anything mean. I think he just liked hanging out. I live in a block of flats. It's a bit of a rough area in my opinion, which occasionally has some sketchy characters going about. There are 2 buildings, and in one of them is a washroom where the residents all go to use the washing/drying facilities. I'm a 31-year-old woman, and use these facilities not as often as I'd like to, because more often when I go, the same guy just keeps appearing. The washroom is usually busy. It can take a few visits to go at a time when the machine is not in use. Despite that, it's very rare to ever see anyone down there. There's no one person I've ever seen in there twice, except a man who's always washing his teddies. The first time I saw him, he didn't say much. He looked like someone you'd give a wide berth. He was visibly twitching, and possibly had learning difficulties, and didn't really say anything. Until one time, after a few run-ins, he took his teddy out the machine, held it up like Mr. Bean and said, "Hello," to me through the teddy. I can't really remember my reaction. I know that when I responded I tried to be as nice as possible, considering he probably has learning difficulties and could need a special approach. By now I've been here for 2 years, and he's the only person who keeps reoccurring in the washroom, and this time I'm in there before he is. He's standing at the door and I try to make polite conversation. I'm busy doing my laundry while he stood at the door with his full attention on me, and as he speaks he sounds normal. His tone and demeanor is different to the way he normally is. He talks about how awful lockdown is, tells me where he works, and that he still has to work. You know, normal stuff. After a moment had passed, he quite firmly and in an irate tone says, "I'm just gonna be socially distant." I apologize and give him plenty of room to get by. He goes to his machine besides mine, takes out a teddy from his laundry, and again, like before, speaks through his teddy. I was about done filling the machine at this point, told him to take care, and left, feeling very rattled with this strange change in character from the man who spends all the time washing his teddies. When I returned to the washroom to put my clothes in the dryer, I'd taken my time to return, maybe 2 hours or so, as I didn't want to run into the guy again by going back at the same time. However, when I got there, someone had been in before me and removed my clothes. They had been all thrown out and down the back of the washer. Definitely not by accident, and this freaked me out. I picked it all up, threw it in the dryer, and rushed back to my flat and told my boyfriend what had just happened. He told me not to go back tonight, and that he'd go finish it off. However, he'd just started cooking, so it was a long while before he returned. When he went to the dryer I'd put our clothes in, they too had been removed and thrown all down the back of the dryers. Nothing else in the washroom had been tampered with. To me, this was a targeted attack. The first instance, I thought maybe someone had had a bad day, but with hours between my moves and my clothes being targeted, I felt directly threatened. I know this could be a coincidence, or it could be nothing, but my instincts tell me something more sinister could be going on, and could have been going on for a while. With no real evidence, I can't raise the alarm to the police, but I'm very scared, and I'm going to continue documenting this. What do you guys think? When I was living in college, my roommate and I started hearing tapping coming from inside the walls behind our closet in our dorms. It was always around 3 a.m, and it got worse, and hangers in the closet began to move. The worst was when we thought inviting a friend to sleep with us in the room would make it stop. That night, with 3 people in the room, a book literally fell off the shelf. A hat also fell off the desk with no wind. You'd think it stopped with someone random in the room, but it actually got worse. Supposedly 20 years earlier, someone hung themselves in the closet in the same dorm we were living in. I had never experienced anything paranormal to that extent, but it was all the proof I needed that there was indeed something out there. My dad used to be an airline captain for a major UK operator. Back in the 90s, his flight to Kabul was hijacked and the terrorists demanded a ransom and would not let anyone off the plane once it landed. They stayed on the tarmac for 3 days straight in 45-degree heat, during which period no contact with the ground services were allowed by the terrorists. A couple of passengers died from heat exhaustion and dehydration, their bodies remaining in the cabin. Once the situation was brought under control, my dad returned home. He suffered persistent nightmares which culminated in a series of heart attacks. He was finally medically discharged and never flew again. The sky was his life and love. When my wife was 1, she gently touched a picture of her deceased grandfather, who she would not have known anything about at that point, as no one had explained death to her yet, and they didn't talk about death and deceased family members in the family. And she said that she'd met him before she was born, and that he was nice to her. He is the person she was named for, and that incident made me feel really happy. Whenever anyone asks what happens to you when you die, my answer is now, I have no idea. But it's the same place you were in before you were born. When she was 2, she was talking to someone, apparently a little boy that wasn't there. When I asked her about her imaginary friend, she solemnly told me that he lived in our house a long time ago. I asked no further questions, but about a year later, after we had moved out, our neighbor caught his kid talking to an imaginary friend. When we asked him, he was told that the boy she was playing with was my daughter's friend. At least, if it was, the ghost was friendly. I slept at my grandparents' house pretty frequently growing up, and I hated it. I remember there were animal skins on the wall of my grandparents' house that they used for decoration. I guess it was a thing. And these little people, looking back, I think I would classify them as fairy-like, and would zoom from the skin with my covers and laugh and jump all the time. They would play around on my covers and then sort of hang off the skin when they jumped back off it, scaling their little terrain. Even as a kid, I would frequently check that my skin during the day didn't have any bumps or anomalies that would lead me to believe I saw something moving on it, when I didn't. And of course, there was nothing. Now I chalk it up to a high imagination period. But one thing that I do not regard as my imagination was when I went to stay at my grandparents' house, when I was somewhere between 11 and 13. I stayed in this same room. The skin had been tossed or moved at this point, and I went to lay down in bed one night. I'm a very light sleeper, and my grandpa always watched TV downstairs for most of the night, while my grandma would come up and sleep around 10 p.m, and their room was down the hall and to the right of mine. As I lay down at around 9 p.m. or 11, I kept hearing footsteps on my ceiling. The footsteps had a rhythm to them, and you could hear the weight of each step, and they would walk perpendicularly across the room above my bed, left to right, and sometimes walk back right to left the way they came. Or sometimes the footsteps would reset on the left side and walk across again. Initially I thought, oh, they have a pull-down attic, but there isn't any room for walking, and my grandparents wouldn't be up there. Perhaps a squirrel? I double-checked my hypothesis and went to check on my grandparents. My grandpa was watching TV with grandma. Weird. The pull-down attic was also above the stairs and sealed shut. So I go back to lay down, and the walking continues for 20 minutes, and grandma comes up and walks to bed. Finally, I get up and tell grandma about the strange noise, and ask for a fan to drown out the noise. I set the fan up, lay down, and try and get some rest. Oh boy, the footsteps intensify now, and the pacing seems to pick up over the fan. On one particular pass, The footsteps stopped midway on the ceiling directly above my bed, and plain as day, something with a deep voice whispers into my left ear. "So you know I'm here." I don't think I could get out of bed so quick, and I slept in my sister's room on the floor after that. When I was a toddler, I got slapped on the back by something. I've never screamed so loud. My parents looked back, and there was a big red handprint on my back. They think it was something that my aunt saw, which appeared, allegedly, like an old woman wearing a cloak, but had a tail dragging behind her, walking from their room to the bathroom. I'll never know for sure, but it definitely freaked the family out. I was flying a Cessna 172 with my instructor, out towards Blythe on the way to San Diego hangar, when a sandstorm blew up underneath us. I swear the sand was so close it was causing the landing tires to spin. This was on a 3-leg check flight. We had landed at Big Bear, California to fuel, and our hot low-pressure system moved in pretty quickly. It was moving in as we were getting there, like really hot 120 degrees or so, and the air was already thin. A kid in his solo was taking off, and he got her up off the end of the runway, and he just fell out of the sky and crashed. The air was too thin because of the heat, and he ran out of runway because he couldn't get up to speed and just pulled up instead of listening to tower and aborting. He crashed and died. My Uncle Bill died when I was 4. He and I were incredibly close. He was my favorite, and I was his. I lived in Colorado, but we went down to Alabama for his funeral. I'm 31 now, so I don't remember him actually visiting me. But I do remember telling my mum, "Mum, Uncle Bill says it's gonna snow." My mum calmly reminded me that Uncle Bill was gone, and we were in Alabama in 1995. It doesn't snow here. Uncle Bill and I got the last laugh when we woke up the next day and it was snowing in Alabama. Very lightly, but it was there. One of the scariest things to happen to me whilst flying was a skydiver about 20 yards off my wing. I was flying into a 172 in an uncontrolled field that I've flown into 100 times before, not knowing that after a 5-year skydiving ban there, they were allowing it on a case-by-case request. While flying in calling my position, I hear "skydiver" in the air. My first thought was, I hope they aren't flying in this direction, and then there he was. I had the image of him going through my propeller, and then immediately the thought of, "Oh God, please don't let me kill this guy," and then complaining that the pilot didn't call this better. And I watched as he flew off completely once the guy had jumped out. I come to find out the pilot was flying his friend to skydive to his local field, then depart to his home airport where they came from. Never did find the guy. One of the popular means of transportation in my city is the subway, but the stations are quite old, so many of them don't have escalators or elevators. Because of this, often enough, I help old people with their groceries or parents with their strollers climbing up and down the stairs. One of these times I was helping an old lady carry her stroller down the train platform, and there was this clerk cleaning the platform with one of those big sweeper things that you push around. You know, they're slow and heavy. He was short and about 60, with hair missing from the top of his head, wearing big glasses. After I helped the lady, I leaned against the wall and started scrolling through my phone. The man reaches my position on the platform, and from where he was, he said, "Thank you for helping that woman." I raised my head from my phone and we both smiled. Then he says, "You're an angel." And I smile back, not really knowing what to say. Kind of embarrassed, I looked back at my phone and immediately get the idea to thank him and tell him that what he did made me feel good. However, when I looked up moments later, there was no one to be found, nor the machine he was operating. The doors where the subway clerks store their equipment at the end of the platform, and we were nowhere close to them, as we were in the middle. I have no idea where he could have gone. No more than 3 to 4 seconds had passed between our exchange and me looking up. I never told anyone this story because it's kind of self-centered and hard to believe. People can dismiss it and say that I just wasn't paying enough attention, but there was legitimately nowhere for him to go without making a sound like that. My fiancé was flying a military plane, working, when he looked out the window and noticed one of the turbines on the wing smoking. He radios up, trying to stay calm, and goes, guys, I think our wing is on fire." And the pilot goes, "Damn, again? Hold on, let me kill the engines." My fiancé says he's never been more terrified than at that moment, especially because if the plane goes down, his life is not the priority. The destruction of his equipment was, even if it cost him his life. They killed the engines, coasted for a minute or two, then turned them back on and everything was good. What's really bad is the other plane was under maintenance for an even worse issue. So that was the only plane that could get into the air, and it had to fly constantly for their mission. So they had to keep using it until the other plane got fixed. My fiancé wasn't part of the regular crew. The normal guy was sick, and my fiancé had the training and clearance, so they pulled him for it. And he said he never complained again about loading or unloading the planes after that. I was at my girlfriend's parents' place with her. They live in a small town in Iceland, in the old doctor's house. It was the middle of the night and I had to get up to pee. And I had this really uncomfortable / bad feeling when from the corner of my eye I noticed a woman stare at me, wearing an old-timey dress. I turned to look in her direction, and there's nothing there, not even an old oil lamp or something. It sent chills down my spine, so I hurried back to our bedroom and asked my girlfriend, "Do you guys have any ghosts?" "Oh, yeah, my brother refuses to sleep in this room because one night he couldn't move and when he opened his eyes he saw a face." "Was it a woman's face?" "Yeah, I think so," she replied. Apparently this woman died under the care of the good doctor, and I was not the first nor fourth to see it. She's apparently harmless, but goddamn it freaked me out. And my girlfriend was just sitting there, acting like she's the Pope's pajamas. I also think it's important to note that a number of other people had experiences in the house, including an old psychic / seer who refused to even pass the threshold into the house. I live in an apartment complex right next to a 7-Eleven, literally a 2-minute walk from my door. So since all this quarantine lockdown mess, I've been staying up later than usual till maybe 2 or 3 a.m. most nights. And last night, it was a little after 12, when I had a taste for some chips and decided I'll just go across the street to 7-Eleven, which is something I do frequently. So I make my way over, and on my way I had to pass this man who was browsing on the red box kiosk. I don't think much of it. I go inside, get some snacks, pay, head out the door, and as I'm coming out, the red box man is literally staring dead at me with these scarily bright eyes. Not wanting to freak myself out even more, I say to myself, maybe he's just zoned in thought. I wandered into La La Land myself sometimes, so by thinking that, I was trying to make myself more comfortable having to walk past this strange man. So I'm heading back to my apartment complex, which is on the side of the street, and has a creaky gate. I realize I was walking and never heard it slam behind me like I always did. I look back, and this man is right behind me, not close up but definitely following. Once again, trying to ease my mind, I'm thinking maybe he's just going home, but I also noticed he didn't have any disc in his hand, for as such as he was at the kiosk for the whole time I was in the store, taking my sweet, indecisive time. So not wanting to come off as scared, I keep my distance and pace. But I probably should have sprinted because, well, being nice. Anyway, I'm literally just a few steps from my door, which is upstairs, and the man randomly calls out, "Hey, do you have a lighter?" Out of instinct, I turn my head to the fact that I knew someone was speaking to me and respond, "No, sorry." I didn't want to just go upstairs because I didn't want to let this man know exactly where my apartment was. So I planned on walking around until I lost him. But then he asked me another question, if he could use my bathroom. I tell him no, that my roommate would be uncomfortable with me letting someone else in this late. I mean, I don't have a roommate, but I didn't want that man knowing that. I keep walking, but this man was still following me. "Do you live around here?" I ask. "I have a buddy that doesn't. I was supposed to meet across the way, but maybe he fell asleep. I've never been here before. I do know his door's 201. Could you help me find it?" And then I think, 211 is my door. Plus, if you have a friend that lives over here, why are you asking to use my bathroom? I knew this man was lying and up to something, and I quickly came with, 201? That should be right past the pool, right next to the laundry area. My friends are waiting for me, so I should get going. My gut told me to head to my car though, because what if he watched me, where I was going, and decide to give me a surprise later on? No, I'd watched too many movies and read too many stories. So I started heading towards the parking lot, not running but definitely walking quicker than before, when I realize he's chasing me. I hurry up, pull my keys out my pocket, get into my car and immediately lock the doors. The man begins pounding on my window, telling me to open the door. I can't help but focus on those creepy blue eyes, but then I notice he was reaching for his pocket. I start my car up before I could see what it was, and I heard a pop, and didn't give a damn at that moment so long as I was away from him. I drove maybe 5 minutes down the street to the Acro gas station and called the cops. Waiting on the police to arrive, I noticed what the popping sound was. The wacko popped my back tire, probably with a switchblade. Of course, when the police arrived and went to check the area, the guy was gone. They did question the 7-Eleven clerk, and he let them know that the man has been there a few times since last week, but has never been a problem but is obviously homeless. I'm still shaken up about it, and I'm going to stop the late night 7-Eleven visits from now on. When I was 15, my dad was driving to a friend's house to practice some roller hockey. My buddy lived in a 2-story log cabin with a long, winding driveway. It was the first time I had been to his house, and I had been told by his parents that he wouldn't be home until later in the evening. As we drove up, my dad said he thought my friend's parents weren't home, so I told him they weren't. He then points to a 2nd-story window and says, "Well, someone's here." I look up and see an older male dressed in Western clothing wearing a big cowboy hat. This is Texas, so it's not that unusual. I say I guess they got home early and shrugged it all off. A while later I mentioned something about asking his parents something, and he says they won't be home till later. I point out both my dad and I saw someone in his house, and he freaks out because no one was supposed to be there. When we go into his house to check, we don't find anyone. After his parents got home, we were in a back room of the house and I see a picture of the guy who had been upstairs. I point to it, and my buddy turns white and says that was his granddad who died 6 years earlier. Turns out my buddy's parents believe their house to be haunted by multiple spirits. Last summer, I was helping my boyfriend clean up his house a bit. At least 2 or 3 times. I swear, I felt him stand right next to me. But he seemed to be across the room. I brushed it off. Then he was running some garbage outside to his dumpster. As I was sweeping, I took a step backwards and felt something brush against my back. So I said, "Oh, sorry, I didn't hear you come back," as I turned around thinking I'd bumped into him. And then my boyfriend walked in through the front door in the other room. After that, he told me that his whole family had had stuff like that happen all the time, and they're pretty sure their house, which is a massive 3-story place, which is over 100 years old, has at least 3 different spiritual inhabitants, and he assumes that one got curious. My father was a commercial pilot for over 35 years, and had been flying for over 45. He has all kinds of wild stories which range from searching for debris after the Challenger disaster to the mayhem he ensued as a pilot during the 9/11 attacks and even towing banners at the Jersey Shore. But the craziest story I've asked him to retell a million times took place over the coast of New South Wales in Australia in the late 1970s. His plane and crew were in a traffic pattern, and they were delayed landing because there was quite literally an unidentified flying object on the radar that the tower was tracking. For a while they just circled around in a pattern waiting for other planes to land before they could enter the landing pattern, and lo and behold, the crew eventually got a direction of where this thing was, and when they looked out the window they could see a cigar-shaped craft moving very slowly in about their same altitude. Upon seeing this, all of the crew and passengers who could see it audibly gasped, and my dad says that was the most disturbing part. Eventually, it went off scope, and they just all cleared to land and nothing more came of it. But it was always my favorite story to hear from my dad when I was a kid. When I was about 12 during a summer, my sister, who's 5 years older than me, was out with friends at work. We shared a bedroom. I was up late doodling in a notebook in bed and had an older glass TV next to my bed that was turned off. At one point I looked up and saw in the reflection of the TV screen my sister walk out of the bedroom doorway and into the stairwell. When I turned to greet her, she wasn't there. I get up and walked into the stairwell, and all of the lights are still off downstairs and in the bathroom next to our bedroom. So I think she must have ran downstairs really fast and head down myself to find no one. At this point I'm getting a little spooked and wanted to prove myself wrong, so I went outside and her car was still gone. I sprint back inside and run back upstairs to my parents' room and wake my mom to tell her I was pretty sure I had just seen a ghost. She was too tired to do much for it, so I went back to my bedroom petrified. When I thought back on it, I realized the girl I saw was wearing a long-sleeved dress that looked somewhat vintage, and my sister was very much a tomboy in those days, but she had blonde hair like my sister and was looking towards me while walking out of the room. I stayed awake with my light on until my actual sister got home, and I felt safe to fall asleep. It still creeps me out, but I do think about it from time to time. I don't really believe much in an afterlife, but I know I saw a young girl walking out the door. I wasn't tired. I hadn't been watching anything earlier in the evening to scare me, and even further wasn't scared when I first saw her because I thought it was just my sister. I can't explain it though, and I never saw her or anything like it again. This happened on a commercial flight, and we were never told what actually happened. The cabin started becoming visibly smoky and smelled strongly of smoke. It was in the window seat, and the wall/window became hot to the touch. The scariest part was that the flight attendants were clearly panicking. They were running up and down the aisles, frantically feeling all of the overhead bins for something on fire. They asked us repeatedly to check our devices to make sure nothing was overheating. People were having panic attacks, and I started wondering what it would feel like to die and how it would happen. The pilot announced that we were close enough to the airport that we were going to continue, about 15 to 20 minutes, and have to make an emergency landing. When we landed, the runway was lined with fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue vehicles. They didn't let us off the plane for quite some time. Ultimately, firefighters boarded and ushered us off. They never told us what happened. I had to fly back with the same airline 2 days later. While checking my bags, an employee said, "Oh my God, you were on that flight." He gave us a $15 in-flight credit and told us to call the airline for more compensation. Never did, but I still wonder, what the hell happened? This story happened to me at the time when my best friend and I were volunteering to clean up a cemetery after a big storm my senior year. We were walking along, talking, picking up branches and stuff from the storm, tidying up stuff left on graves, just making an afternoon of it. And suddenly at the exact same time we both froze and turned to look at the same spot behind us. After asking each other what we heard, we confirmed that we both heard a woman's voice go, "Shh," right behind us. It wasn't like the wind in the trees. It was almost like the sound a librarian would make when you're talking 5 decibels too loud. And we both looked at the exact same spot from where it came from. There was no one there. The closest person to us was a good 50 feet away, and they'd have to yell just for us to hear them. Curious, my friend took a look at the headstone right there, and then looked at the one next to that. It was a mother, buried with her infant. We were disturbing the baby. We even apologized for being too noisy after that, and went on our way, not wanting to offend the spirits. When I was 15 years old, my great-uncle passed away due to a sudden heart attack. Me and my father had to clean out his house since no one else in the family wanted to. My great-uncle was very much loved by all of us, and was really one of the nicest and most loving out of all of us. My father was just as broken up about losing him as everyone else, but the job had to be done. So we got there early in the morning to get it done. His house was very neat and well organized, so we would be done in a day or two tops. I remember as a kid we would always play over at his house when my dad had to work, and he would let us play anywhere in the house but the attic. He made it very clear to us that going up and down the ladder to the attic was dangerous. Therefore, we never went up there and never thought anything of it. Even though he would go up there sometimes for about 30 minutes and then come back down, never actually bringing anything down with him or taking anything up there. Well, anyway, while we were cleaning, I decided to finally go up to the attic to see if there was anything up there. It was completely empty besides 2 boxes that were tucked away in a corner. Thinking nothing of it, I picked them up and took them downstairs. Once I got to the living room, I opened them, expecting to see papers because the boxes were so light. Instead, I found all these pictures. I'm talking hundreds of pictures of what I could tell were pictures of 3 different women, all from angles where you could clearly tell they didn't know they were being photographed. He had pictures from daytime to nighttime, multiple locations. Some were undressed, in others they were just doing everyday things like cleaning or cooking. With every picture I looked through, my heart started to beat faster and faster. I realized one of the women was his wife, who had passed several years earlier. I looked on the back of the pictures and they were named. I didn't want to freak my family out without knowing exactly what I was looking at, so out of curiosity I googled the other 2 names and found one of the ladies on Facebook. So I know this is messed up to say, but I was glad to see that she was alive and okay. Once finding out that I showed the pictures to my dad, he was as shocked as I was. So he took the boxes, and I've never seen them again. We've never spoken of it. Still, every once in a while I find myself wondering why he had those pictures, and if he took them himself, or had someone else take them. I loved my great-uncle very much, and I couldn't imagine him being anything less than a stand-up guy. I don't know what to think. I know this may not really be scary, but it certainly freaked me and my father out pretty bad. This occurred when I was around 2 years old. I personally have no memories of the experience, and this is mostly based on what others have told me. I was staying with my paternal grandparents, and I described to my grandmother about how an old lady with a dog sat down and read to me in her backyard. She asked what the name of the dog was, and I told her that the name was Bo. My grandmother called my mum and told her what I had said, and my mum told her that my maternal grandmother, who passed away a few years before I was born, had a dog named Bo for a while. There was absolutely no way I could have known that prior to telling my grandma, so I 100% believe that the ghost of my maternal grandmother decided to pay me a visit that day. I'm a 20-year-old female, and the story that I'm going to share with you happened recently. I've had many creepy encounters and experienced a lot of truly scary things during my life, so I figured you guys would appreciate this story too. I and my mother decided to go grocery shopping together 2 days ago, so we took the car and she, as I don't have a license yet, drove to the nearest and biggest mall to get many supplies as possible. Because of the ongoing lockdown for the pandemic, it's better to make a few trips to avoid unnecessary contact with people. It took us a while to arrive there, and once we did, she pulled up near the stores where I could see a couple of men. It is very common in my area to find people stationed in malls and supermarket parking lots, as they usually are quite harmless if you do as they say. They stay there waiting for cars to come, and when this happens, they show the driver some parking spots to ask what is called a protection fee. Basically, you pay them, otherwise they will damage your vehicle. It is of course illegal, but the government here doesn't really seem to be bothered by these kind of activities. Anyway, we met those illegal workers many times before, so it wasn't anything too unusual or scary for us at first. My mother parked the car and then 2 of the men came near her window and asked for the fee, which wasn't much, luckily. While she was giving them the money, I looked up the side and was staring, and then froze. There were at least 10 other men. 2 of them were fighting. I didn't know over what. One threw a punch, and only when I looked closer did I see something shiny in his hand. It was a knife. I started freaking out internally because of the situation. It was way more dangerous than it seemed at the beginning. The worst scenarios were running through my head. 2 women, 10 men with a weapon? It then brought me back to reality when my mother told me to get out the car to reach the store. So immediately I jumped out my seat and got to her side, ready to protect her. But when I saw she was chatting and exchanging jokes with one of the 2 dudes from before, I realized that she hadn't seen the group of men that was approaching us. My mum has a very sunny and friendly personality, which let me tell you can be a very dangerous thing around strangers. And I'm not blaming her, I love my mum, but an excessive, expansive attitude can cost you a lot. I know I sometimes come off as an antisocial, but better to be careful and distant than have a knife in your throat. I quickly told her we had to go with urgency in my voice, but kept a cold and firm tone. If you show people you're scared, then you're screwed. She followed me, asking what was wrong and trying to tell me that we were safe, so I whispered, "Keep going and stay silent." And only then did she see the group of men staring at us. She proceeded to look in the other direction while walking, but I didn't get it. I gave one of the men a full look of hatred that was screaming, "Don't try and harm us or I'll fight you." I know they were numerically superior, but I have been doing boxing for years and I wasn't going down without a fight. The man got the message and looked away. It was still broad daylight, so if I screamed, people would hear us and the cops, plus criminals prefer it, as I said before, to make easy targets. I hadn't brought any weapons with me that day, but I'll make sure never to make that mistake again. When we got out the mall, it was getting dark. I suggested a secondary way to get to the car. The men were all still in the parking lot. There was a little light and we also had a lot of things to carry. We made it to the vehicle safely because they didn't see us coming. But I swear I'm never going out without some form of protection again. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't looked out the window or my mum hadn't listened to me. So just please, guys, always be wary of your surroundings. This happened back in middle school. I received violin lessons from one of my teacher's old students. My teacher always told us to be careful and very respectful in the practice room. It was a soundproof room that we had in the band building, because that was the most haunted room. My teacher said that you didn't want to anger anything or anyone in there. While I was waiting for my violin teacher to come into the practice room, I set up a chair for me and a chair for my violin teacher and placed it side by side. I ended up practicing for a few minutes by myself, and that's when it happened. As I was playing music, the chair next to me looked as if it was being grabbed by someone, and it spun around and faced me. The chair even slid back a bit, as if someone had sat on it. Not gonna lie, I freaked out and was screaming internally, but decided to keep on playing because whatever it was wanted to watch me play. As I continued to play, my violin teacher walked in, saw my freaked out face and saw the chair facing me. He kind of smiled and said, "Oh, so it happened to you too, huh?" He just shrugged it off, grabbed a different chair and sat next to me, and we proceeded with the lesson, with the chair still facing me. I have never been so freaked out in all my life. I was once on a flight over the North Atlantic, and we fell out of the sky for about 2 minutes after dinner was served. I don't know about you, but 2 minutes of free fall, falling out the sky, can ingrain a particular kind of fear that most of the world fortunately doesn't have. It's that feeling of almost certain death as you plummet to what you expect to be your end. I put a dent in over the panel that holds the reading light, and one of them fell out. Not to mention someone up front-ended with a drink cart in their lap, and the person in the row ahead of me got my steaming hot stew all over their head. I got off that flight soaked in Coca-Cola and with a bruised head, and a fear I'll never be able to shake. Close to a year ago, a friend and I went to a local cemetery. We hadn't been there in 12 years, and nothing paranormal had ever happened. Well, this time something did. My friend and I decided to go ghost hunting and exploring in a cemetery in a town that I used to live in. We were bored and thought we'd go after midnight, because they say it's the witching hour. We went into the cemetery and fell very heavily in there, but the moon was out and gave illumination since we didn't have flashlights. We started walking on the path, attempting to stay away from the graves as we wanted to be respectful of the dead. It started feeling weird at times, like being watched, also seeing shadows moving and getting feelings of goosebumps. My friend said he saw what looked like a winged, shadowy thing descend into the sky, and we kept hearing the crunching of leaves and unintelligible talking or whispering. We tried walking into one area but got this weird feeling of dread or something lurking that wanted to be ambushed. So we noped out of there and went into a different path in the cemetery. But then the mood vanished behind the clouds and it got darker. We'd been there for maybe 45 minutes, and then this feeling of dread crept up on us, and we slowly made our way towards the exit. Mind you, my friend was walking much faster than me and was slightly ahead, and I was maybe halfway near the exit when I felt something hit me on the left, near the back of the ear. It felt like a round object. When it happened, I yelled at my friend. I explained that as a kid I hated when some kid in class would hit me in the back of the head with objects, and it used to really get on my nerves. At first I thought he threw something at me to be funny, even though why he would do it wasn't exactly very justifiable. He said he hadn't, plus he was ahead of me, so it wouldn't have been possible. We ran out into the car and drove somewhere where we could discuss what happened and what we saw in the cemetery. To this day, we're not entirely sure what occurred. We've tried to debunk it, but cannot find any rational logic for what happened to me. For like a month, I felt like a totally different person and didn't have any paranormal things happen to me at all. My Chow Chow passed away in December 1999. She was almost 14 years old. One evening in the late spring of 2000, I got an unusual urge to go out onto the front porch. The porch and front of the house were brightly lit by a streetlight across the street. While standing outside, I hear a chuff 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 noise coming from the left and getting closer. This sounded exactly like the sound my Chow Chow would make when doing a fast walk. The sound continued approaching from the left. By now I'm looking up and down the street, in yards and over railings, trying to ascertain where the noise was coming from. There was no one in the street, no one in my yard, and no one else outside. I looked and looked, but couldn't find a source, and the noise kept coming. When the sound was right in front of me, it stopped, as I felt the sudden presence of my Chow Chow. I broke into happy tears and enjoyed her presence and thought how much I loved her and missed her. I thought how it would be to have her back with me all the time. Something inside me told me that having a ghost, albeit a dog ghost, with me all the time may not be the best thing. So I told her I loved her but that she needed to go on with her journey and that we would be together again. The chuff 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 noise started again, moving to the right, away from the porch, and continued for a short while, getting continually fainter. I never heard the noise again, but I do believe we will be reunited one day. My great-uncle Ira flew in a B-24 in World War II as a bombardier. He never talked about the war, especially to a kid who was only 11 or 12 in the mid-80s. But one year he came to our town for the 4th of July. We were watching the fireworks in our front yard, and he went missing. I went looking for him and found him at the back of our living room sitting on the floor. I was just a kid and didn't understand what PTSD was, although later in life I realized that I knew and worked with a lot of people who had it. I asked what was wrong, and he just looked at me with these haunted eyes and said, I used to look down through my recticle at towns and cities we flew over, and I'd see these little pops of smoke, and I'd know they were coming. He went on to describe the flak. How you could only barely see the flak cannons firing if you were pretty low, and then you couldn't see the shells until they started blowing up all around you. He told me that he felt every little white pop of smoke he saw, as if it were the one that was going to bring him down, like it went right through him. I didn't see it, but every time I see flak in movies now, I think of my great-uncle Ira and that look in his eyes. My mother was involved in union affairs, so I often had to accompany her on business trips. One time, we stayed in an old tuberculosis hospital that had been converted into cheap motel/hotel suites, and, as I learned, was awash in horrifying ghost stories. Let me paint the picture. This hotel spital was extremely conservative in its interior design. Everything seemed to be utilitarian, from the rooms having exactly 2 beds, a table, chair, and a desk and nothing else, to the bleachable plastic lino coverings on the floor, to the exposed white pipes that came through the ceiling that still had its original plaster crown molding. Along both sides of the very wide hall that composed the main building were rooms besides each other that were clearly once patient rooms. But running down the very center of this hall were its own rooms, with windowed walls and doors, leading onto this little courtyard, usually with some couches and a TV and other stuff like that. These doors could be slid open, so you could easily pass through them to the other side. You could see through the large window walls to the other rooms lining the other side of the hall, so this center boulevard of lounge areas barely felt like a room at all. The various tales surrounding this infamous long building of rooms were so. The flute-playing girl. A girl with long hair would be seen in windows on the top of roofs and in mirrors, or too far away for people to properly make out. She would play a flute in a strange, disjointed manner. Throughout the night, I realized the pipes would often make a whistling noise as water rushed through them above our heads, and wondered if that was the origin of the tale. Then there's the story of the suicide nurse, a woman who worked at the hospital and couldn't handle seeing so many deaths and hung herself. Apparently no one had any idea that she had been so badly traumatized and didn't see it coming, so it was a shock. People reported leaving at night for some reason, the bathroom, getting a snack, etc., and returning to see their beds made up. One woman I spoke to had this happen literally every night, and had assumed that it was some sort of janitor or hospitality worker that just popped in to do it quickly at 3 a.m. for some reason, and didn't think of it after that. There were no overnight staff that would do that though. Then there was the story of the yelling group. People reported hearing loud, heated sounding arguments between several men coming from down the hall. Too far to make out the words, but definitely obvious angry and violent sounding. People would call the front desk about and get, "Oh yeah, that's just... ignore that, it's no one." Because they'd grown so used to getting the reports of the fighting noises. And the odd things would be that one room would hear it, but no other rooms on that floor ever would. And the most famous one is the "Where are you?" ghost. The hospital used to be located near a river that was frequently used by First Nation communities before it was settled by immigrants. A man was returning home by canoe, and he heard someone screaming in fear, begging for help. He began shouting, "Where are you? Who's calling?" trying to find them and help them. But it just ended slowly in screams until it was gone. Unnerved, he hurried back to his village, only to find it entirely razed to the ground. Those who were standing on the banks of the river will hear the sound of the people crying or begging for help, maybe even their name. And it has the name Appel River. For those who don't speak French, it translates as the river of who is calling. Back in late March, my girlfriend and I moved out of a house we rented with our 2 roommates, our pandemic bubble, C and J, and they moved into their own place on the other side of town. One couple usually visits the other at least weekly, time permitting, and this instance in April was the first time they'd spent time in our new apartment. We'd been fairly isolated in the small community we'd lived in before, as we were one of the last few to move out while they were condemning the properties due to disrepair. Therefore, we weren't used to having neighbours anymore. We'd had a casual interaction with one woman that lived next door while we were moving, and she complimented both our hair colours, and we knew we had an upstairs neighbour, but this was the extent of our familiarity. That is until this night in April, when we were all interrupted by a knock at the door. It was a heavy-set bearded man that lived upstairs, whom we'd never actually seen before, but occasionally would hear talking or watching TV if things were quiet enough. The guy asked if any of us had a phone, and upon realizing 3 of us either didn't bring it or didn't have enough charge for a cell phone, C offered to let him use hers while they stepped outside for a moment. The rest of this is mostly an account from her and her boyfriend, as they were the ones outside, but we could faintly hear what was going on. My understanding is that the man dialed the number, pulled out a notebook, scribbled with various pandemic-related things, and then alluded to the voicemail system that he had information for the United States government on what was going on regarding said pandemic. But the part that shocked all 4 of us was when we all heard him reciting what looked like a Bible verse in tongues that he'd also written down. He seemed polite and casual before all of this, interacting and greeting with us with a "Hey neighbours," and thanking C&J for letting them call. So this had us all shaken up when they came back in and told us the specifics. We were curious and called the number saved in her recents, and we looked into C's cell phone, and the number and area code looked so unfamiliar to us, in addition to the mention of the government and secretive behaviour, that one of us decided to look the number up. We found out that not only was it based in Washington, D.C., but it was the number that matched NASA's headquarters there. Now, we're not exactly sure why he thought NASA was the authority to go on here, but needless to say, when he came back the next morning asking if either my girlfriend or I had a cigarette he could bum, I had to force the memory of him speaking backwards into NASA voicemail out of my head, and it was still a super uncomfortable experience. We haven't seen the guy since, and his apartment has been vacant since a few weeks after this. Wonder what happened to him. One night, my grandmother was driving, and she came up upon an intersection. She had the right of way, so was just going to keep driving, but suddenly, a bright white figure darted in front of her, causing her to slam on the brakes. She was shocked, and took a moment to look around for whatever did that, but nothing was there. Not a moment later, an 18-wheeler came barreling through the intersection. If whatever figure did not dart in front of my grandmother's car, she would have likely been killed instantly by this 18-wheeler. My own story is on the scarier side of the paranormal. I was about 10 years old and had just moved into a new room in the house. I was super happy to have a bigger room, but I had always avoided sleeping in it when it was a playroom for some reason. The first night I found out why. As I lay in bed that first night unable to sleep, I began to see some sort of figure standing in the corner of the room right near the light switch. It was a very vague humanoid shape, but that's all I could make out. I stared at it all night until I was finally exhausted enough to fall asleep. Over time I kept seeing the figure standing in the same spot unmoving. As time would go on, the figure became more defined. After about 3 years of seeing this figure almost nightly in my room, I was able to see it clearly. She had a very feminine figure, but was very tall. She had shoulder-length hair that was straight and fell over her face, and abnormally long arms that reached down to her knees. Her fingers were long and sharp, almost as if they were blades, and reached down to the floor. She had no color to her, just a mass of pure darkness. Most nights she would be staring into the corner, and these nights I felt fine. I felt no bad emotions coming from her at all. Some nights she would be looking at me, but I couldn't see her eyes. These nights I would feel uneasy and struggle to sleep, but nothing scary ever really happened. When I was about 16 was when things got scary and borderline violent. One night when she was facing me, I caught a glimpse of her eyes. I froze up completely. Her eyes were piercing and pure blood red. What I felt that night was pure hatred and malice towards me. This was the first time since she started appearing where I couldn't sleep, until I passed out from exhaustion. She didn't move at me at all, thankfully. After that night, things changed. The shelf in her corner would always have things moved around. Sometimes she would wake me up by throwing things from the shelf on the ground. Eventually, she even tried throwing things directly at me, but she never left her corner. One night when I was 17, I saw her move for the first time. It was one of the bad nights where she would throw things at me, and I woke up to a book hitting the wall dangerously close to me. I immediately looked up to where she would be standing, and saw her slowly but surely lifting her spindly arm to point at me with her blade-like finger. The emotions I felt in that moment were all over the place: fear, anger, sadness, malice, and all sorts of negativity. It overwhelmed me to the point of passing out. When I woke up after that, it was dark, and the negativity was just as intense. That's when I noticed she had moved from the corner entirely. She was standing above me by the side of my bed. I even tried to scream and run away, to punch her, but I couldn't move. All I could do was cry. I don't remember how I got out of the situation. The next week I slept on the couch in the living room. I tried to go back to sleep in my room after a week, but she was still there. She never got that intense again after that night. Eventually, I went to college, but when I came back for home breaks, she was no longer there, and I haven't seen her since I turned 18. Let's keep it that way. When I was around 8 years old, we moved into a new house. It wasn't old, but it wasn't a fairly new build either, perhaps made in around the 60s. Everyone got their own room, and this was the first time I had my own. I thought I was a big shot. A little background. I'd like to call myself somewhat of a sensitive ever since I was a child. I could sense something or someone around me, especially when no one else could. Fast forward to when I was around 9, it was the first year we were in the house, and I could feel the presence of something in there, but never really thought anything of it, considering it wasn't too negative. There were 3 rooms that I didn't really like being in because the energy felt somewhat dark: the basement, the bathroom, and the attic. I didn't mind being in the basement when I had friends over, but when I was alone, I couldn't be in there for more than 5 minutes without getting the feel that I was being watched. In the bathroom was a cabinet that was very deep. You could literally fit 2 grown men in there, and I never understood why it was so large. But it didn't feel right, and I would often feel drawn to just look inside and stare for a few minutes, and I would get a very uneasy feeling. The attic, on the other hand, was a different story. I never opened it. I kept the door shut at all times, Something was up there, and it did not want company. One night I was laying in bed. It was around 2:45 a.m. when I heard footsteps in the hallway. I assumed it was just one of my brothers coming home from a night out with friends. My bedroom door was open, so I looked to see if anyone was walking around. I stared for what seemed like 10 minutes and no one went by. I got scared, so I decided to wait it out. As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I thought I could see a human-like shape in the corner of my bedroom. I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, so I tried to turn over and go to sleep. But I felt like I was being watched. Now, in a 9-year-old's mind, it's the boogeyman. So I quickly hopped out of bed and tried to run into my mum's room. Her room was only 2 doors down from mine, and in order to walk out of my room, you had to pass a wall that was somewhat slanted. In order to do this, you had to walk sideways. As I did this, I felt 2 hands press down on my shoulders, and I froze in fear. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream. I was a prisoner in my own body. Then all of a sudden, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. In my ear, clear as day, I heard heavy breathing. It didn't sound human. My eyes widened. Then I felt the pressure lift off me. I could move again. And I ran so fast down the small hallway into my mother's bed. That whole night I kept hearing someone walk back and forth in the hallway, but I refused to look through the doorway. When I tell you that I didn't sleep that night, I mean I didn't sleep that week. The next morning I walked into the hallway and just so happened to look up. The door to the attic was open, and I asked my mum why she was up in the attic, and she said that no one was there, and there was no reason it should have been open. My stomach felt like it was in my throat. I knew that whatever was in the attic was in my bedroom the night before just watching me, and I'm thankful I got out of bed when I did, because if I didn't, I don't want to think what would have happened. I'm 22 now. I can still remember that night as if it were yesterday, and I still can't sleep with the lights off. So to whoever you are that grabbed my shoulder, let's never ever meet again. My bedroom is on the 2nd story. The stairs are to the right of my bedroom and bathroom door. It started out like a normal dream. At the time I thought the whole ordeal was real. I came downstairs when I heard my mum come home from work. She set a cute-looking porcelain doll with wavy brown hair and a frilly white dress on the counter, and said she went by the thrift store to pick it up. Oh sweet, I say, and I inspected it. Mum walked down the hallway to her room, and I carried the doll back upstairs with me. I set the doll on my nightstand, and as I'm just getting laid down under the covers, I hear my mum screaming, "No! Don't take it upstairs!" Then there's banging on the walls. At that moment I'm rigid, staring at the ceiling. Nausea sets in, blackness, and a woman with black eyes and rotting flesh appears above me, hands gripping and pushing my shoulders down, and I can taste salt and blood. Her open, screaming mouth is dripping, cold splashes on my face. My ears are assaulted with the worst scream I've ever heard. Just blood-curdling sobs. It was so anguished. I just can't move, staring up at this woman who's still just grasping at my neck. I soon realize it's a dream, and honest to God, all I can think about is, I can't believe my brain is doing this. Her image becomes hazy, and I start to come to. It's only about 5 a.m. when I wake up. I expect it to be 3 a.m. I'm surprised it didn't terrify me as much as it should have. I'm just a really jumpy person. So a couple of minutes after reviewing this, and I get sick. I've seen this woman before. I certainly believe in the paranormal, but I'm not horrified by ghosts. My experience has taught me that whatever you're dealing with is dead and gone, and simply doesn't have the willpower to hurt you. In the aforementioned hallway downstairs, there's a bathroom on the right. There's a curtain that blocks the rest of the continuing hallway. I must have been about 13 to 14, but I was really into the paranormal. The hallway and bathroom lights were off, and the atmosphere felt right enough to do a little Bloody Mary game. My parents were right outside on the porch, so I felt ballsy enough to try it. I leaned to the bathroom and said the chant and ran out of the bathroom, past the curtain and into the continuing hallway. Now, I can't explain this, but I've mentally checked it over and over. The curtain seemed to lift away from the ground, and a woman with long greasy hair, empty eye sockets and a lipless grin slowly leaned out the bathroom door. And I kid you not, I kicked her, but heard nothing. I can't describe how the thing vanished, and I booked it past the hallway outside my parents' room. I was getting chills, and I never told anyone about what I saw. I just didn't want to think about it this time. I've since been baptized, and I'm hoping that no more spooky ghosts will choose to attach themselves to me. This actually happened on my first time flying with no instructor aboard. I was just doing a couple of laps around the specific traffic pattern. I took off, lap 1, lap 2, it went fine. Nailed a couple of radio calls and got that awesome feeling of, yeah, I got this. But lap number 3 was fine until I was setting up my final approach to land. And the GTN 750, which is basically a fancy navigation, radio and pseudo radar system, warned me about a Cessna 1 mile out at the same altitude. I ignored it, since I already had the plane in sight and verified with the control tower that he was landing on the runway parallel to mine. Lo and behold, this dude zips under me about 200 to 300 feet, which sounds like a good amount of room, but it's actually butt-clenchingly close in a busy airspace like this. I should have applied full throttle and circled back around again to try, but the other plane was clear of me before this startle factor even wore off. This was made especially dangerous by the fact the plane I was flying was low wing, so I can't see underneath me, and the other plane was high wing, and he couldn't see above him, so neither of us could see each other, and the tower yelled at the guy to get out of my way. And I managed to land safely. But seriously, it could have gone terribly wrong. My grandmother passed away from cancer 2 years before I was born, and my grandfather had a room where he kept all her things such as jewelry, pictures, her china and crystal collections, etc. I moved abroad at quite a young age, but would stay with my grandfather when he visited, and my brother and I would often be given her room to sleep in during our visit. It's hard to explain really, but I always felt there was something lightly off in that room. I didn't mind sleeping there, but I also didn't hang out in the room much during the day, even when I was much younger. Before we moved abroad, the room wasn't one I would play in. I always played in the room directly next to it. Fast forward to when I was 10 years old and visiting my grandpa, staying in the room as normal. The room was super dark at night, and my grandpa had these super blackout blinds to let no light in. I woke up in the middle of the night, and I could see this floating figure at the end of my bed. What I saw I can only describe as this very white glowing thing. As I said, there was no light in this room at night, but this thing was bright white. It looked like it was draped in this white see-through stuff, which floated as if in the wind, blowing inside the room. It stood there for a moment. It wasn't terrifying at all. The thing is, it was almost calming for a 10-year-old to see something like that. But it did freak me out, and I hid under the covers until I passed out from exhaustion. I still think about it from time to time. Like I said, I don't know what I saw. I like to think it was my grandmother since it was her room, but who knows? I've never really been able to rationalize what I saw. But I haven't slept or spent more than 5 minutes in that room since. And it has been 17 years. During a night cross-country with a friend of mine who was also a pilot in a 172, we were flying across an area by some mountains that's entirely lava rock. There's nothing there and no one really goes there. Anyway, we're flying when we suddenly see a bright light off our left wingtip. It was matching speed with us for 5 seconds, then zipped off towards the mountains and disappeared behind them. We both looked at each other, and we still have no idea what it could have been. But my guess It's not a UFO. Growing up, there was an extra room upstairs in our house that we used as an office. It had a closet with one of those tiny attic access doors on the side. We'd sometimes all be downstairs watching TV, and we'd hear a creaking sound moving towards that room. The room was next to mine, and sometimes I'd find the closet door open with the light on, and the little door to the attic cracked open. There was a spot on the wall that our declawed cat would always attack. There was missing paint from the cat attack. All of that was creepy, but the night the dog, who never came upstairs without my dad, started barking in the hallway by my room towards the office was the worst. She barked and growled for a bit. Then she started backing off into my room, while looking up, as if she was staring at the face of a person approaching her. She backed into my room and then squealed like she'd been stepped on, and ran into the far corner of my door and put her nose and eyes into the corner and whimpered. I picked her up and went downstairs to sleep on the couch. This was 14 years ago, and I'm still freaked out by it. In my current home, the common one thing we would hear is random footsteps and the sound of our upstairs hall switches flicking on and off. But the lights wouldn't turn on or off, only the sound of switches, which are unmistakable. The one that scared the living hell out of me was hearing someone upstairs banging on my door desperately at 3 a.m. I used to think my parents were the ones making the switch noises and the footsteps. My parents assumed it was either me or my sister rushing to turn off the lights to act asleep when we heard them coming upstairs. So my dad did some sneaking around when he was positive he could hear a switch sound. He came into our rooms and noticed we were snoring. I did my fair share of investigation too, and found out it wasn't by any of us. Now onto the door banging situation. It was a Friday night, and I was super tired. I slept at probably 9 or 10 p.m. and woke up briefly at 3 a.m. to check on my phone. Then I heard it. A loud, bang-like thing on my door for about 3 seconds. I felt the vibration on my bed. I tried to make sense of it. My dad has a habit of banging doors when we lock them, but I flashed my phone light at it and it was unlocked. Plus my dad would yell our names, and I didn't hear anything. I was 20 and scared to death, and hid under my blanket and slept after some time. At lunch I asked if anyone did that / heard anything, to which everyone denied. It's definitely not wind, since we closed our windows, and it wasn't a windy day to begin with. Plus I experienced what wind can do, and this was different. Other than that, it's just the sound switch, and maybe the laundry basket moving a few times, but nothing physical happened. I'm not particularly bothered by it. I was minding my own business today at the dollar store, stoned off my arse looking for some candy. I tend to look down when I'm in public places like stores, as I'm socially anxious and don't like people talking to me. So I really didn't notice the guy at first. But then it was hard not to because he kept pacing up and down the aisles, grabbing packages of cookies and putting them back, acting really shifty and weird. I walked by him as he mumbled something to me about being hungry. I looked up at him and gave a fake laugh to be polite. He was white and bald with a tattoo on the back of his head, and as I walked past him he said, "Damn girl," and looked up at me and down and smiled. I ignored him and kept looking for the candy. He struck up a conversation with me saying, "Yeah, just got out 3 days ago. Did 25 years. "Wow, what for?" "Murder," he said matter-of-factly, and looked right at me and smiled. I started to panic a bit internally, but played it cool. He asked me where I was from, and what I was doing there. I told him I was from Texas and visiting my boyfriend. My boyfriend lives in a small town about an hour outside the big city I live in, so keep in mind this is a small town within Texas. "Oh, I'm from California, just got here," and winked at me. "That's cool." I then walked to the register. He didn't even give me the 6 feet. He stood so close to me in the line I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I said, "Dude, give me 6 feet. I don't know what diseases you have from the pen." He was like, "What, the coronavirus? You think that's serious?" "Absolutely." And then I walked out the store. Luckily, there were 2 other employees sitting out front who I told what was going on. One of them walked me to my car as a cop was passing by, and I've never been so relieved to see one in my life. And he walked up to us as I was getting in my car and telling her goodbye and bummed a cigarette off her. I got in my car so quick and locked the door immediately. He seemed like he was trying to get in the passenger side when I locked the door, but he just walked off and started looking around the parking lot. I burned off so quickly. "Mr. Murderer, don't you know that it creeps girls out when you tell them you just did 25 years for killing someone? Seriously, let's not meet." My mother opened a clothing store, and the building she and her partner rented was at one time a popular brothel. It's a beautiful building, but very haunted. One night she had closed up for the night, locked the doors, set the alarm and went home in the evening. Then around 3 or 4 a.m. the police department called her and told her someone was in her store and had turned all the lights on, and it looked like end caps and things were turned over and items were all over the floor. The police told her that they didn't suspect anyone was in the building and the doors were still locked. They also said, by the looks of things, it was extremely unnerving and that it would be better if she went to check on things. So she did. When she got to the store, she went into the basement where handbags and merchandise were kept in storage. She said the door, which was locked by deadbolt, was wide open. The handbags were thrown around and clothes were scattered all over the place. Fast forward a few months. Both my parents decided to open up a restaurant and things get weirder. No one who owned the building prior ever mentioned any paranormal activity. But after working in the kitchen for almost 3 years, I've got a few stories that are unexplainable. On a busy Friday night in the summer last year, a stack of pizza trays flew off a rack and almost hit me in the face. I've had water pitchers thrown at me by this ghost as well, and I think that same week the fridge door opened up and a box of pork flew out maybe 4 or 5 feet onto the ground. My head chef saw this and we freaked out together. More recently, this ghost has become a fan of turning on mixing bowls and moving plates around. It hasn't thrown anything at me recently, but the one time it threw a pitcher at me, it did hit my hand. My head chef said he'd seen the ghost, and it's a woman wearing a red dress and looked like she's from the early 1900s. Sometimes at night, we will hear someone walking around after everything and everyone has left the building. At this point, it's not really scary, just a regular thing. It doesn't like women though, and it's actually pushed my general manager up against a window and held her face against it. She no longer goes into the kitchen at night. We believe this ghost is connected to the clothing store ghost and that my mother carries her spirit around. It's very odd and sometimes scary because the ghost isn't always peaceful. Sometimes new hires get excited and agitated, in which case I get very serious and tell them to knock that out and that it's not funny. My dad used to be a pilot. He once told me about how he almost crashed his Cessna because he hit some geese. He was actually preparing for a landing approach when he hit geese flying into a patch of fog. Windshield was completely shattered, and he and his passengers were covered in blood and feathers. They landed safely, but my dad was pretty scarred from that. He didn't quit flying because of it, but bird strikes remain a constant fear of his. Geese are large birds, and they did significant damage to that little plane. When flying an aeroplane, you'd be surprised how oblivious some pilots can be to others sharing in your airspace, and the dangers that this cause. Such as the following example. Another plane on my left, with a distance of about a dozen feet between our wingtips. I was told after the fact that the pilot had a habit of doing unusually fast landing approaches. He was behind me, but he was so fast that he overtook me while I was in the middle of my final approach. This conversation with the tower ensued. Tower, Delta Echo Romeo Papa, do you notice anything unusual around you? Negative, Tower. Pull up and go around now. Turns out the dude never noticed me. But for all of those non-pilots out there, this is what it meant. Had he approached me a little more to the right, his propeller would have made fine powder out of my own aeroplane, and I'd have come to a very definitive end had the tower not asked him to move. This happened a few months back around March, about the time the world really entered stage 1 of the pandemic. The bank I needed had closed down all the main offices and had limited its hours from 10 to 4. Because my old debt had expired for the bank, I had to go in and get a new one to put money down on my credit card. Of course, since it was the only bank of this company open, there was a huge line. Getting to the end, I nodded to the person ahead of me and simply focused on the story I was reading on my app. I'd only been standing there about 5 minutes when someone else got behind me. His clothes looked dirty and he had a smell to him. I assumed he was homeless since we were in the downtown area of my city, but I gave him a smile and a nod and tried to get back to my book. But he didn't let me. He suddenly mentioned he had been bit by a dog. At first I thought he was just making conversation, but then I looked at his hands. It was wrapped in tissue, but the finger that had been damaged had a decently long cut from the second knuckle to the nail bed. The tissue was covered in blood. He said how I had attacked him suddenly and tried to step closer to me. I told him to please step back, and he took that as an insult and stated that it wasn't infected. I told him it was social distancing, not the cut, but that he should probably get it looked at before trying to go to a bank. We live in Canada, so we should have just gone to the ER. It's free after all. He stated he needed to just get his money and leave. He then turned away to the person behind him in line. We stood in line for 35 minutes before I was finally able to talk to the security guard who was just inside the door. I explained to them a guy behind me had an open wound from a dog, but I had tried to tell him that he shouldn't come in here. The security guard grabbed the manager, and they went out and explained that he was unable to enter until he had cleaned it up, as it was a biohazard. The manager even let him know once it was cleaned, he would be rushed to the front of the line, and he saw me inside and gave me the dirtiest look before storming off. My friend has insisted that his parents' house was haunted for years while we were growing up. His sister told stories about a ghost that would turn her TV on at nighttime or do something like shake her bed while she was in it, but I never really believed them. One day they asked me if I would house sit for them while they were all on vacation. It's where my drum kit lived at the time, so I was always there anyway, as my friend and I were in a band together, so I didn't think anything of it and said yes. And that was when my first and only paranormal experience happened. I'll never forget it. I had slept in on a sunny day. It was around 11 in the morning, and I had nowhere to go. I was laying awake in bed in the spare bedroom upstairs, knowing full well that I was alone in there, when all of a sudden the sound of an adult man singing opera filled the entire house for about 30 seconds. It was extremely loud and unignorable, and I will never forget how scared I was. And after the singing stopped, my heart was absolutely beating out of my chest. I got dressed and sprinted out of the house as fast as I could, and didn't go back to finish my house-sitting duties after that. I figured the ghost had it handled. At my local small-town airport, there's a skydiving company. They cycle two planes up and down on busy days, and usually are a few minutes behind each other. But last summer, I happened to be parked by the airport watching, and their planes landed simultaneously. This is a single runway tiny airport. One was on the runway, and one in the grass behind it. It was pretty shocking to see. I'd watched a lot of planes land, but I'd never seen that. Last summer I saw two of their divers pull their secondary chute on the same jump. I was watching one. Their chute got tangled in itself and wouldn't open. They were violently spinning out of control. It was scary because I was right below the drop zone. There were a lot of people like, "We gotta move." But they dropped free, and a few seconds later the secondary chute opened. Not 10 seconds later, the same thing happened for another diver. One of their chutes landed near my house, and the other a few meters away from a busy highway. That place always makes me nervous. I still live in the neighborhood, but me and my cousin used to live in a place that's known for being haunted. The house was featured on many different ghost hunting shows. Me and my cousin, who we will call Kyle, both had encounters with ghosts there. The ghost was always a man dressed in all black. Black fedora, suit, pants, black shoes, black suitcase. Kyle was with his parents at the time when he saw him. He was sitting on a cardboard box at the end of the second-story hallway. Note that you had to walk this way to get to where he was living. While he was walking with his parents down the hall, he asked them, "Who's that man?" pointing at him. His parents were confused as they couldn't see who he was pointing to. They had asked him, "What are you talking about?" Kyle kept pointing to the man. His parents just shrugged it off and said, "Honey, no one's there." My encounter with him was a bit different. We had these washer-dryers that were next to the stairs. Now, if someone was standing there, you could only really see half of their body. I was by myself at the time, but I was going down the stairs, and I could see a man standing at the washers. I could only recall seeing him from the corner of my eye, but once I blinked he was gone. I was really confused because I swore I saw someone there. A few years later I heard that Kyle saw the same man, told his parents about my encounter, and that's when I learnt that the town had to burn many dead bodies because of a plague that had rolled into town many years ago, and many of the houses, including mine, were used for burning bodies. My town is a little bit messed up. I'm a bush pilot. I loaded an aircraft with 200 kilograms of dead wild boar once and climbed to cruising altitude, and the thing starts squealing and unraveling from its straps. Its head was poking out of the bag, looked right at me and went crazy. I've never been so scared in all my life. No autopilot while flying in cloud, and I only had a screwdriver for self-defense. Air traffic control couldn't hear me beyond the squealing, so they weren't letting me into their airspace. So I just found some random strip and landed there. The villagers still think I owe them a pig. The pig's head was about a meter away from my microphone. I couldn't even hear myself speak. After a few more attempts trying to get clearance, they said I needed to adjust my radio. It was more convenient just to find a small airstrip at that point and let the villagers handle it. I also had an image of a big old piece of bacon running across the airport apron, charging passengers and boarding their plane. It wasn't ideal. My sister and I were sharing a room. She is about 1.5 years younger than me. We would watch TV from our bunk beds every night. I had the top, she the bottom. My sister would also steal the remote and put on YouTube. And as some may know, YouTube stops playing after a while of inactivity. Well, one night I woke up to a voice saying, "Help me," very quietly. It was close to me, but I could tell that it was saying it to my sister below me. I always had a blanket over my head and have a little hole to breathe, so I opened my eyes under the blanket and listened. It said these words twice before it came up to my ear and whispered the same thing. I curled into the fetal position and tried to calm myself, but it got worse. For some reason that I still don't know to this day, I uncovered my head. Big mistake. The end of my bed was against the wall, which is important. Something was sitting there with long black hair, nothing but a grey face and a long white dress. I ducked my head back under the covers and cried. I tried to call out to my mum, but my voice wouldn't make a noise. I later cried myself to sleep. What's worse than that? I thought it was a nightmare. I told my mum in the morning what happened and drew a picture of her. A few years after, the topic popped up again. Somehow, something my mum never told me was that the same night she actually did hear her call out for her. When she checked, I was already asleep. I'll never forget that night. It was horrible. My husband was working in a town called Moose Jaw in Saskatchewan. We usually just rent a short-term room or house where he's working since he moves around a lot. This time he was renting the attic of an old house on a main street. It was a large old home with multiple levels. Each level was being rented out as the owner renovated the home. I'm the type of person who loves staying in older houses. I especially was excited to stay in this house because of the strange architecture. You had to take a steep staircase on the side of the house up multiple floors to get to our suite. Once inside, you walked right into the bedroom with the kitchen and bathroom along the back wall. As soon as I got into the house, I had a strange feeling, like chills down my spine. I told my husband and we chalked it up to moving jitters. Things got strange from here. The bathroom and kitchen were both tucked into small cutouts in the house. The roofs were short, and I could barely stand straight at 5'2". In the bathroom there was a little door, a wall hidden behind the old clawfoot tub. Every time I would go to the washroom or take a bath, it sounded like someone was lightly tapping on the door. A few nights I started to have really bad nightmares. Ones where my husband would have to wake me up because I was screaming so loud. I felt like I was pinned to the bed and wasn't able to escape. I had never felt anything like that before. I can't explain it, but it felt like I wasn't wanted, like something was wanting me to get out or else. I stopped sleeping during the night because I was so scared of having nightmares. I would sit in bed and look out the window just hoping for daytime again so that I could leave the house. I must have drifted off to sleep at some point because the next thing I knew I was being dragged off my bed by my feet. My husband was sleeping next to me, and I remember grabbing onto him as though my life depended on it. He freaked out and jumped out of bed. Whatever was pulling me stopped right in front of the steep stairs. We did not stay there another night. I still sometimes doubt that it even happened, but thankfully my husband witnessed it and can reassure me I'm not crazy. Whatever was there in the house was not friendly and did not want me there. I will never return. I was once flying a plane, and the scariest thing that had ever happened to me was this occasion when I saw the smiling faces of two people in a Cessna as they near missed flew by me during training in our local practice area. They weren't talking to anyone, and it was surprising to see an airplane just appear then go past so quickly. But the scary part was seeing their eyes and teeth. They were that close to my plane. It was uncontrolled airspace, and I guess ultimately we were both responsible for separation, but it happened so very quickly, and even without a lookout, it's not really easy to spot a glint of metal in a vast open sky. When I was 10, I was in bed with my back to the door, and suddenly felt something standing in my bedroom staring at my back. I'd never felt scared in that room before, but in that moment there was no doubt something was in there with me. I was frozen in sheer terror and couldn't move. Dead silence. Just me and whatever it was, and after a few minutes I screamed bloody murder for my dad, who came running into the room. As soon as he opened the door, he asked me, "What was that?" Every once in a while, one of us would bring it up. It never happened after that. This one is a little banal, but it is just as real. A few years ago, I moved into a 4-bedroom home. One of the bedrooms always had a vibe to it, nothing bad, just definitely a sad place. The rest of the house was fine, but me and one of the kids stayed out of that room whenever possible. When she was about 8, out of the blue she asked me who died in the room. I told her it felt like a dog, and she said, "I was thinking that. Somebody loved him." I also want to add that my dad had the house blessed by a priest around then. I can't recall if he did it before or after, but the point is, the blessing didn't take. When I was 13, I was at a church youth group sleepover that was held at our youth group's leader's house. We were going on a ski trip the next morning, but I wasn't feeling well after dinner, so decided to go to sleep early upstairs while everyone else was watching Big Mama's house downstairs. I was in a sleeping bag on the floor of one of the empty upstairs bedrooms, but it was hard for me to fall asleep because my throat was really bothering me. There was no one upstairs besides me and a baby sleeping on his own. At one point, the baby started crying. The mum/youth group leader's wife came upstairs to check on him. He stopped crying and then she went back downstairs. I remember hearing all of that happening, and also hearing laughter and sounds from the movie downstairs as well. After the youth group leader's wife went back downstairs, I was still having trouble falling asleep. I was looking around the dark, empty room when all of a sudden I see movement from the corner of my right eye, like something was moving towards me very slowly. I look to my right and see a headless figure in dark Victorian-style dress floating towards me in the dark. I remember this figure had no head, and the dress had a white collar with some sort of brooch in the middle. It had long sleeves and it was puffy from the waist down. I can still see it in my mind almost 20 years later. I was completely frozen in fear as it slowly floated towards me, and I finally got the courage to pull the sleeping bag over my head. I used to be really religious, so I just kept saying the Lord's Prayer over and over. I was like suffocating inside the sleeping bag and didn't have the courage to run downstairs. Eventually I was so tired I fell asleep with the sleeping bag still over my head, and I woke up the next morning still scared from what happened, but I never told anyone at church about this or asked the youth group leader about his house. I still can't look at dark-coloured Victorian-style dresses without remembering this traumatic experience. My grandparents would hear things in the attic, like conversations, music boxes that would play. Most notably, they would hear a baby crying. My grandmother sewed things for everyone in the family in the attic. She worked in a sewing factory. If you ripped your jeans, the attic is where you got them fixed. My grandmother would go up there often, and there would be boxes in the middle of the floor opened, absolutely not how she left them. The sewing machine faced a window. On the windowsill were a bunch of small Mother Mary figurines. They got the house blessed regularly by a priest, and every time he came he left a Mother Mary figure. To my knowledge, there was never anything sinister that happened, but I'm not sure I was shared everything by them. Why else would a priest come so often? I can at least say that I myself have never experienced anything in the attic, or the house, and never felt anything sinister there. I think the priest stopped coming before I was born. I also remember the story of my cousin who had a mattress. She thought it was haunted. She said she would feel like she was awake all night trying to get out of bed but couldn't. That happened every time she slept in it. She'd then wake up exhausted. After complaining enough, her dad thought she was nuts, so took a turn sleeping in her bed. He felt the same thing, and the mattress was thrown out. While I was clarifying with my cousin about her experiences with the mattress, I learned that the mattress itself came from my grandmother's attic. I worked in a 90-year-old bookstore. 2 months into working there, the long-time owners had decided to retire, but soon after, the assistant manager chose to keep the place open despite the long-time owners having sold off 90% of the stock. The assistant manager hired family and friends and kept half of the old staff, including me. A few months in, one of the friends she hired, who ran our computers after we closed at 9 p.m., said a man would appear on the basement stairs at 10 p.m., would walk to the back of the store, climb the stairs into the loft and disappear. The assistant manager took this story with a grain of salt, as she was religious and did not believe in the paranormal. But then family she hired started staying late too, and they began seeing the guy as well. Eventually, the assistant manager stayed there late and claimed to see him as well. 6 months into the assistant manager running the place, a lady showed up with pictures of the store from the 50s, saying she had worked there in the 60s. I asked her if she'd ever seen the ghost. I worked for him, she told us. She explained that the ghost was the owner within the 60s. In his time, the store closed at 10, and he would go around looking for last-minute customers before heading up to the office. Meanwhile, I always had the morning shift, and I'd start coming in before sunrise because we had someone stealing all our newspapers from the front porch. I would go inside and wait in the nearby dark for the newspaper truck to drop them off. It was a few days after hearing the story about the old manager. I'd just bought the papers in and was hankering for donuts from a nearby shop. As I was about to leave, I turned back towards the darkness and said, "Go to the donut shop, want anything?" I didn't hear a voice, but the words "bear claw" popped into my head. I ran for the door, getting the creepy feeling that if I stuck around for one more second, I really would hear a voice say, "bear claw." I was a flight attendant for a while, and we used to get into the cockpit sometimes mid-flight when one of the pilots needed a wee. Pretty standard procedure. So one time, sitting there and chatting with the first officer and it's pitch dark outside, I noticed a yellow flashing light on the horizon. It was the only thing I could see outside and didn't really think much about it, and kept talking with the pilot. After a few seconds I looked again and it had moved considerably. I couldn't tell the distance, but I would say it was far away from our aircraft, so I started to think something weird was going on. Immediately I told the pilot and we couldn't figure out what it was, and we just stared when after maybe 5 seconds later, it just flew from one side of the sky to the other and then into space. That gave me the most ominous feeling I'd ever had. I looked at the pilot, he looked back at me, and we sat there in silence thinking what the hell just happened. Immediately regretted not taking my phone out to record, but it had been a good story to tell on the following flights. When I was around 7, I woke up in the middle of the night because I thought I heard a loud noise in the house. I walked out of my room and glanced down the long hallway where I could see the street light shining through my window onto the kitchen floor. I rubbed my eyes, and I saw what appeared to be my younger brother standing just beyond the beam of light in the shadow. I walked towards him to see what was going on, and as I grew closer, it became more and more clear that this small boy was not my brother at all. It was super still, with its head tilted, and was just staring at me with these piercing dark eyes that I'll never forget. I ran straight into my parents' room as fast as I could, and slept on their bed that night. I never brought it up with them, and I did my best to try and forget about it. I think I almost convinced myself that I made it up in my head. Fast forward several years later, and I'm a senior in high school, hanging with my then girlfriend, my brother, and a few of his friends at our house. It was dark and storming outside, and our power had gone out. I decided to light a candle, put it in the middle of us, and we were all just laying there, talking out on the floor. Someone randomly suggested that we tell ghost stories, and immediately I thought of my encounter 10 years prior. I said, "Guys, I'm going to tell you something that I've never told a single soul. I saw something many years ago right here in this very house, and I don't care if you believe me or not. I 100% saw something right over there," pointing over to the kitchen. Before I could even start my story, my brother goes, "Wait, are you serious?" I glanced over at him confused as to why he interrupted me. He then looked me dead in the eyes, his face distressed and turning a little white. Did you happen to see a little boy?" My jaw dropped. I was at a complete loss for words. Everyone around us immediately started freaking out too, because they instantly grasped that we had both seen the same thing, and I still get goosebumps just thinking about it. I was piloting Capella Javelin, 60 kilometers northeast from Dawson City. While flying relatively low and admiring the view of the wilderness, we saw a person below who was just standing and watching me from below. They were neither clothed or wore pastel-colored ones, and this stunned me for a bit, and I decided to make a broad circle above him. He, she, they didn't wave or try to attract my attention in any way. They just stood there, looking, and it soon dawned on me I felt really uncomfortable. Then it hit the fan when I saw 10 to 12 additional people slowly emerging from the closest trees. All of them were either wearing nothing or just pastel colors. I turned around that instant and floored it. I don't know what was there, but I had to get out of there as quickly as possible. I was walking towards the station to get my train home. I missed the last one, so I had to wait a full hour. Because of the coronavirus, there aren't that many trains anymore, and I decided to call a friend of mine to kill time. When I walked down the stairs to the platform, a guy who was sitting next to the bike rack stood up and followed me. I went to sit at a bench and put my bag next to me. The guy who was following me walked even closer at first, and I thought nothing of it. He surely was going to pass me, right? At 2 meters distance, he locked eyes with me, grinned, and walked straight towards me, sitting next to me on my bag while grinning at me. Our shoulders touched, that's how close we were sitting. Keep in mind this was recent and during the pandemic. We were still the only ones at the station and the train wouldn't be coming for a long time. I did the most logical thing when someone strange sits on your bag. Jerked my bag away from him and walked a bit further away while swearing at him for a bit. My mate went on to tell me some personal stuff on the phone, so I didn't want a stranger hearing that, so I walked over to the next bench. When I sat down, I saw the guy stand up immediately and walk over to me. He was trying to get my attention, leaning into my view, grinning and waving all the while. When he started coming closer again, I flipped him off, and really should have said piss off, especially in these dangerous times, and walked past him. This time I positioned myself so I could see him approach me as soon as he stood up. Luckily he didn't try anything else. I am wondering why the hell he was even trying in the first place. Creep. This happened when I was little, the summer before first grade. A few months after moving into our new house, I would complain to my parents daily about a scratching noise coming from the closet. Every night I'd hear it, and every day I would tell my parents. My mum slept with me one night and heard the scratching too. She told me years later that the night she spent in my room with me, she felt something grab at her leg, almost as if it was trying to pull her off the bed. I remember the night after she slept in my room. We had a living room slumber party. My mum attempted keeping me out of the room, so we all slept in the living room for a few days. I started to hear the scratching in the bathroom as I was brushing my teeth a few days later, and I called out to my mum that I was hearing the scratching again. She came into the room to comfort me, and we all left. We both noticed a cut on each of our feet, in the exact same position that had not been there the day before. We stayed with our grandma after that day, and moved into a new house after that, and never went back to that house. I was so young at the time I didn't really understand what was happening. But now I get it. If my mum hadn't have stayed with me in the room that night, who knows how long we would have lived there. To borrow my late uncle's story, he confided to me. He had a 182 on floats, and on several occasions was happy to play family airlines so that various relatives could make weddings and other events that were just too far for driving and overnighting. One trip was from home base Vancouver to Kamloops in the interior. He flew over VFR, and it was a pretty simple task to head out up the Fraser Valley until it pinched off at the town of Hope. At that point there is a notch in the wall of mountains through which the Coquihalla, both rivers, and Highway 5 goes. From there, following Highway 5 northeast brings you straight to Kamloops, their destination for the day, probably a 200-mile flight. The morning flight up was fine. The 3 passengers went to their event, and come afternoon's end they head back in what was supposed to be clear skies. Supposed. Flying the reverse route, clouds began to form quickly, on the forested sides of the valley, and soon rolled over the small plain. He was fairly confident of his heading, and stuck to it as the sky whited out. It was all he could do in a day without sat-nav equipment. If he was off by only a few degrees, they'd fly straight into a mountainside. His passengers seemed to take no notice, as they were recounting the day's events. Trying to climb above the cloud was just as dangerous. Small single-engine Cessnas are not pressurized, and even if it topped at, let's say, 6,000 feet, the last thing he wanted was to pop out on top of what might be a white surface as far as the eye could see. If he could drop down once past Hope, there was a good chance of flying under the soup back to Vancouver. It was, he said, the only time he was really scared in his airplane. The miles ticked away. They should be nearing Hope. He never saw it. Suddenly the clouds scattered, and before him spread the valley under a high ceiling. He threaded the needle, and had been right not to chance climbing it. They landed at the South Airport, and no one even commented about the can of paint they'd flown through. Didn't make me want to be a pilot. I was on an L-1011 flight, going back to Atlanta. We circled Atlanta forever, it seemed, and then the co-pilot walks down my aisle, opens a hatch in the floor beside me, and starts cranking the hell out of a handle. He looked up at me and said, "The landing gear wouldn't go down." I said, "Good to know." I was relatively sure we were all about to perish. Safe to say, we managed to land safely. But it certainly made me never want to get on an aircraft again. Years ago when I was a kid, my next-door neighbor Lila, a sweet old lady who loved doing crosswalks for kids going to school, came over one morning and asked my mum if everything was okay and if she wanted to talk. My mum was confused and asked why she would randomly assume something was wrong. Apparently, Leela had been looking out of her back window pretty late into the night and saw my mum leaning on the fence in an old-looking white dress just staring into the darkness of the woods behind our house for a good while. Only my mum didn't own any white dresses, and she wasn't outside the night before. It still creeps me out to this day. I need to give you a bit of backstory before I tell the story. I was raised an only child, and my parents were both extremely busy with their careers. One of the ways that we got to have fun together during the summer holidays was hiding things. Now, this isn't your conventional hiding stuff kind of game. Imagine National Treasure and the Da Vinci Code mixed in. We'd create little games, puzzles, clues, most of the time while I was asleep. My mum and dad would write these clues, leave keys to boxes and stuff behind the house so that when I'd get up fairly late and my parents would be at work, I'd have something to do other than watch TV. Sometimes they'd take the TV remote or the Nintendo Wii controllers, sometimes even the internet cables, just to spice things up a bit. So if I wanted to do something, I had to play the game. For most people, this might sound like an inconvenience or an annoyance, but to me it was actually quite fun and got me into puzzles and stuff. But now that I've explained the backstory, you'll understand why I was doing this in the first place. It was a generic day in summer, a summer that seemed to drag. I lived in the countryside, very isolated, in a house with no neighbors for a very good distance, although I don't know specifically how far. I'm going to say at least a mile. I really wanted to hang out with my friends, but needed to wait until my parents got home so that they could take me, as the bus was a little bit too far to walk and I really didn't want to do the walk. Anyway, I'm just at home watching TV, when I suddenly want to make a sandwich. And, as I make my way to the kitchen, I realize that all the knives are gone. This is really annoying. I was feeling lazy and telling myself I could just use the long part of a spoon, but decide that perhaps I should find the game in case I need a knife later on. I pull out the drawer further, pull up the cutlery holder, and find a small piece of paper, where it gives an anagram to where I should look next. I go and take the paper over to the kitchen table, grab a pen, and start trying to figuring out the letter combination that will tell me where I can find the knife. Usually in the house, we leave about 3 or 4 clues before we find the treasure. So as I was trying to solve this anagram, I hear something above my head. I look up. There's a definite creaking coming from upstairs, but it sounds muffled, almost like it's further up. I stab a guess. Could it be the attic? Why is the attic creaking? Although we live in the countryside, we've rarely heard any strange noises coming from up there, and this was definitely a first for me. A chill of fright wrung across my back, and I stared up for a few minutes, wondering what to do. After a little while, I decided it must have been my imagination, and there's no way there is anything up in the attic. Like I said, middle of nowhere, countryside. So what could possibly be up there, other than perhaps a wild animal that let itself in? Although I don't know how it would have done that. Regardless, I carry on with my quest. The anagram tells me that it's hidden in a clock. Not any clock, a grandfather clock. And when I get there and have a little look around, I find the next piece of paper precariously hidden behind the metronome. I pull it out and look again. This next clue is hatch. It had a little egg on it, and I knew it was referring to the hatch to the attic. This is where the creep factor got me. Had my parents hidden themselves in the attic or something? Things were starting to get a bit weird. I glanced up at the clock. It was only 10:15. Is it feasible that they waited for me to get up, hid in the attic, and were going to surprise me with something? Maybe. I was starting to grow more and more convinced of this notion, so I giddily made my way upstairs, pulled down the string, and was expecting to get a piece of paper or something, but there was nothing. So, I pulled down the ladder, pulled on the light switch, and started taking steps up to the attic. When I got to about the 5th step, I had to turn on the main light switch to illuminate the rest of the attic. I was so excited. I honestly believed I was going to get some sort of surprise for my parents, but as the light came on, there was nothing. There was only one obstacle. Our water heater was up here, so they could have easily hidden behind it, but I was sure with the light turning on they would have made a noise. I slowly and purposefully make creaking noises as I approach the corner that's hidden. And just as I peek my head around the boiler, do I not see my parents, but some disheveled looking human in what appears to be foul-smelling clothes, old and dank. I think what impressed me the most was the hair. It had become so dirty that it just stuck together. It was honestly disgusting. I had no idea how he even got up there, and for a split second, I didn't know what to do. I was like a deer in headlights. It only took a second to realize what situation I was in, and the fact that he turned his head and opened his eye and stared at me. I almost fell through the attic in horror and quickly scrambled down the stairs, turned the light off, and shut the door in record speed. The piece of paper flitted down to the landing just as I closed the hatch. I didn't even bother picking it up. I ran straight to my bedroom, got my mobile phone, and dialed my parents. My mum said she'd be there within an hour, but to call my dad as he worked nearby. I called my dad, and within 15 minutes he was here, and we were waiting for police. By the time they arrived, they came upstairs, and I refused to open the hatch but told them where he was. It took them no longer than about a minute to handcuff and bring down a really dirty-looking man. He didn't say why he was up there. He didn't say anything at all. Once he left, my dad told me to go downstairs to calm down and to get myself a drink or something while he spoke to the police, just as my mother arrived, so I began filling her in. When my dad came back down with the police officer, they were carrying a small backpack. I assumed it was the homeless man's stuff. Later that evening, my dad filled my mum and I in on what exactly was in the backpack. There was a knife, a rope, duct tape, children's dolls, and a few other questionable things I'd rather not mention. I have no idea what this sicko was planning to do, but the police say that perhaps he knew that I was home alone, and he'd been following my family's movements. He'd taken an opportune moment and then snuck in. Who knows what he wanted to do, or how he got those things. All that I know is that he'll be behind bars for a very long time. I still don't know his name. I refuse to hear it. My father once asked if I wanted to know, but I said no. It brings chills, knowing that playing my silly game almost brought me so close to perhaps death. But what surprises me the most was how he didn't react when I saw him. He just looked at me. Was he really going to use that stuff on me? I have so many questions and so few answers. I really wish there were more to this. As you can imagine, the game my parents played hiding stuff ended after this. When I was in high school, I worked at a spiritual retreat center that was also a convent. It was an old historical building that everyone said was haunted. I had the following experiences there. 1. I was doing dishes with a coworker, and we got to talking about the place being haunted. At one point I said, "How would we even know if this place is haunted?" At that moment, the heavy wooden door that was always open slammed shut behind me. I looked around and there weren't any windows open. The maintenance guys that were sometimes around there weren't, and somehow the doorstop that kept the door open was several feet away. 2. There were several times when I would be running the dishwasher, and a co-worker would leave the room/floor to get dishes from the other rooms. I would see them back out of the corner of my eye and call to them. Then no one would be there. 3. On Sunday nights we worked alone. My first Sunday working alone, I was bringing the kitchen laundry to the laundry room, which always made me feel uneasy when I walked by, and I started hearing a knocking sound. As I walked into the laundry room, the knocking got more frequent. It was loud as well. It just kept going, so I thought there was a machine on or something leaking, or maybe a branch banging on the outside door to the room. So I checked everything out, then opened the back door, and that's when it stopped. There weren't any branches, and the door opened into this area that was closed off, so it's not like someone could have been knocking. I was so scared that I didn't work Sunday nights anymore after that. I was up at a rather nice kids camp one summer, installing some access controls, locks, card swipes and cameras and stuff. It was situated on a rather large lake. There was also a fire nearby. One day, I hear a bomber coming in for a refill. I should also take note that this lake has zip lines going across it, well-marked ones that pilots should be able to see from the air. The pilot saw it when it was almost too late, and I've never seen an aircraft like that climb so fast. People could have died easily. At the old house we used to live in, we believed there was a little ghost boy who lived there as well. My family had seen him a few times in the backyard wearing blue mesh shorts, an orange shirt, and the sneaker sandal things with black and green outlines. He would sometimes run around and play, but there was one time that he really scared my mum. She was home alone when my siblings and I were at school, and my dad was at work. It was around 1, so she had about an hour left before she had to pick me and my sister up from school. She finished making the food in the kitchen and made sure to turn off and unplug everything she used. She went to her room to take a shower, and out of nowhere the blender turned on by itself. As you can imagine, she got super scared and went back to the kitchen to turn it off. She scolded the little boy and told him that he was welcome in the house, but he couldn't be scaring her like that. Luckily, that was the first and only incident that he ever pulled. I used to be a gliding instructor, in those little truss-framed and fabric gliders. We're doing a training flight, and a bolt of lightning stuffs the ground about a mile from us. Unlike a lot of other aircrafts, we don't have a system in place to mitigate lightning strikes. Basically, it would have exploded, a good chunk if it had hit us. I have never descended and landed on the ground so quickly. That could have very easily been fatal. I was at a secondary school camp. Basically, the sleeping area for guys is a fenced-in area that also served as the activity area. There's only one way in and out of the place, and there's a big street light / lamp shining down on that spot, so it's super obvious at night. What happened was I woke up needing to pee. As I walked to the porta potties, I saw an old man walking out of the sleeping area. It was late, and no one else was awake, but I saw it clearly. The old man shuffling his feet and walking out, and the lamp shone directly on him, making him super obvious. I don't think much of it, and just went to the toilet. I had forgotten about it for 2 years, when my friend, who used to be a camp counselor, told us there was a stone in the activity area that served as a tombstone for an old man that died there. I knew he wasn't lying about the stone because I remember standing on it, and then suddenly it clicked, and it made me realize I might have actually seen the old man, because there was no reason for an old man to be entering the guy's sleeping area in the first place, let alone exit it. There were actual toilets on the other side, not porta potties. I'm just glad I didn't follow the old man that night. I used to fly gliders. One of the instructors was very keen in not having the students ride the controls during tuition. If you had to breathe on the joystick, he would let you know in no uncertain terms that he was the PF. Once I'd soloed, he was a bit friendlier than before, and related a horror story of an ab initio student he'd flown with about 10 years earlier. The chappie in question was allegedly a former hang glider pilot and skydiver who was looking to expand his horizons. He was very confident and outgoing. His day job was a managing director, and was obviously very keen to get into the air. Fair enough. Having strapped him into the front seat, our instructor got in the back. The winch cable was attached, and off they went. The student locked on the controls. He had both feet hard on the rudder pedals and was holding the stick centrally, with an absolute grip of iron. He was in total panic, and by this stage the glider was passing through 200 feet and starting to drift to one side. The instructor had to shout at the student several times to let go of everything. By the time he complied, the cable release pulled, and they were a long way off to the side and a lot lower than a normal launch. This was a ride site, and they could have still moved forward to the lift, but he was so shaken up, he elected to fly a shortened circuit and land. Throughout the approach, he was terrified this clown was going to go for controls again, but fortunately they landed without further incident. I suspect the post-flight debriefing was short and interesting, and probably ended with him departing rather more quietly than he arrived. A few years later, our instructor heard he had bought a Cessna based at a field 20 miles away. Perhaps he learned his lesson, or perhaps he was destined to become a statistic. I bought a B&B built in 1850, and after we had moved in, people began to tell us it was haunted. Seems the home used to belong to a local doctor, and it was not only his home but the local hospital too. From the second night there, we started to have strange things happen. My eldest daughter has health issues, and she said someone was sitting on the edge of her bed at night. On the third night, she was brave enough to look to see who it was. A dark-haired man was sitting there, with his head in his hands. Seems our doctor was still doing rounds and was checking up on her. A few nights later, we heard heavy footsteps coming down the hall. I hid in a room and jumped as the sound was right outside the door. And while the sound continued down the hall, there was no one there. My husband left for a few months for work, and we wouldn't tell him the stories of our doctor's visits, and he was polite, but you could tell he really didn't believe us. When he returned for a visit, he was asking about the doc, and if he had really been active recently. We were walking through the halls at the time, and when we reached for a doorknob, the door slammed shut. His hand just froze mid-air, and after a few moments it swung back open until the door handle was in his palm. All the time, I let him know with a smile. The doc also loved to change the radio station and change the clocks, which was a bit of a pain, but it was his house too. One night he set off the smoke detectors in my daughter's bedroom. I went in and took it down. The alarm was still screaming in my hand, and we removed the batteries and it kept on ringing. That event was like a blur, very surreal, and I had to beat the smoke detector to 1,000 pieces before it got quiet. But the best one was to come about 6 months later. We had opened to the public and hosted a very small wedding with less than 30 people in the B&B. The reception was a success, and people began to say their goodbyes while I began to clear up. I took a bunch of dishes back to the kitchen and quickly returned as none of the guests had left, and I saw a man in the adjacent room admiring a print I had hanging over the fireplace mantel, one that looked incredibly similar to the B&B with a fantastic garden. I smiled at him and told him it was one of my favorite paintings, and he returned the smile, going back to look at it. I should have known something was off. Firstly, he was wearing a very old-fashioned brown suit that was in style maybe 100 years ago, but not today, right down to the pocket watch and chain and his shoes. I walked from the room, past the front door into the reception, all of 15 feet. Then I turned to ask if he had enjoyed the wedding, and he was gone. The door was still locked. No footsteps were heard on the wooden floor. He had simply vanished. Our family believes in ghosts, and every time he made an appearance, we would just acknowledge his visit, thank him for caring for us, etc. I still think he was just lonely, and was so happy that the house was being used and cared for again. I am an AF Combat Systems officer. We were on a military training route. Pretty much what it sounds like. Airspace that's supposed to be cleared out so military jets can practice maneuvers without worrying too much about civilian aircrafts. We're about 300 feet AGL cruising along at 420 knots when our TCAS collision alert system, using onboard radar, starts blaring at us. We all look around and don't see anything around us, when suddenly some jackass in a little propeller plane, who wasn't squawking, pulled in a climb about 50 feet off our nose. Pilot brakes hard to the right, and we narrowly avoided a mid-air collision. This could have been disastrous. I worked in a care home, middle of the night shift. Room 24's buzzer goes off, which is weird because it was on the middle floor, and the home hadn't got enough residents at this point to fill that floor. The ground was nursing and the top was dementia, so I get sent upstairs to investigate, and I find the door locked and the alarm still ringing. So I phoned the nurse on duty and she comes up with the key, unlocked the door, and we found the room to contain the belongings of a man who died several months before, and management was storing it until the family decided to do something with it, as they were from Australia. As I went to hit the alarm button to turn it off, the nurse said loudly, "All right, Barry, we'll get you a pint, hold on." She opened a can of beer that we have for residents and left it open in the room. Didn't hear anything else from that room the rest of the time I worked there. I usually go to church with my mum and sister, and last night we went to the Saturday service. After that we carpooled into my mum's car to get some food and then came back to the parking lot a few hours later to drop me off at my car. It was probably 9 PM at this point and we were still in the parking lot, just talking and catching up when we noticed a truck kind of drive around like a maniac. We ignored it until he sped past our car and then immediately stopped and backed up. The guy gets out and runs up to our car, and my mum rolls down the window, and the first thing this guy says is everyone has hand sanitizer since we're in a pandemic and he needs some. My poor mum was probably freaking out a bit, and it was a little weird to open up with that, but okay. Then he starts saying the service was really good, but quickly walks up next to her. Then he, I don't know, reminds her to give her hand sanitizer. My poor mum is scrambling through her purse, and I try to shoot closer and told her to hold on to her arm with my key between my fingers. She finally finds it, pours some into his hand, and he kind of stays there for a second and says he needs more. And as she pours more, he asks for more, and then lingers for a second and kind of walks quickly back to his truck. He stays there for 5 to 10 minutes before driving away, and it really creeped us out, especially my mum. It was like a weird mix of that sugar scene from Men in Black and Ted Bundy, wearing a cast to look less than threatening, talking about church to calm her down. I mean, who knows? I think I listen to way too much true crime stuff, so I might just be paranoid about strangers. But it really freaked me out when he was holding his hands out for more sanitizer, like he was thinking about grabbing her hand each time she poured it out, and staying there idle for 10 minutes. This was back when I was still a churchgoer. My mum, little brother and I would sit close together. It was a small church with a big congregation, so we had to huddle up a bit. My brother was sitting between me and my mum, and he was kind of squished up at the time. About halfway through the sermon, I felt a hand on my shoulder. Distinctly a hand, a soft pressure on the back of my shoulder, and a slightly harder pressure curling into my collarbone. It was a really gentle feeling. It felt like any other time a person would put their hand on your shoulder to comfort you. So anyway, I turned to see who it was. And then, when I looked, the feeling faded. Not lifted like the hand moved. The sensation just kind of melted away as if it had never been there to begin with. When I looked up, I saw my mum looking back at me. She looked kind of shocked. She had felt the same thing. We both looked down at my brother, whose arms physically couldn't have moved that far without us knowing. We acknowledged it in the car on the way home, but never really spoke about it again. My uncle, my mum's brother, died in a car accident when I was about 12, and I was about 14 to 15 at the time, and still recovering from the extended trauma of everything. 22 now, it still happens every now and again. I'll just feel the gentle pressure on my arm, or my back, and it freaks me out for a second. If any doctors are here, I'd love for you to tell me that I have some rare nerve disorder or something, but that's the closest I have to a ghost story. I had a few strange things happen at a house I lived in when I was a teenager. Stuff would fly off my desk when I was in bed. When getting stuff from the basement, I would almost always get physically ill stepping in one hallway on the basement, and then when moving out, my family was in another room. A painting flew across the room and landed in the middle of it. After moving out, I brought it up with my mum, that I also used to see dark figures dart around the corners. She gasped and mentioned to me that my dad had told her that he had seen dark figures too. I used to be fine with turbulence, until I was on a flight from Indonesia that hit the worst patch I've ever encountered. I knew it was going to be rough when one of the cabin crew abandoned her trolley and strapped in next to me. The next hour of my life was by far the most frightening. The plane was about 2/3 full, and there wasn't a single sound from the passengers as the plane thrashed around. I shared a bottle of vodka with the guy sitting on the other side of me. We just passed it back and forth without saying a word. The flight ended up diverting as one of the engines, no joke, crapped out while the plane was jolting around. Can you imagine the fear we were feeling knowing that we were flying one engine short? That was nearly 30 years ago, and every time I think back on it I get chills. I still grip my seat armrest at even the slightest bump in the air these days. I used to work at a casino to set up for big dinner events and exclusive parties. One night it was just me and my supervisor working that night, and I head up to the second top floor, which is a pretty nice bar area of the casino/hotel, and everyone thinks it's haunted for some reason. Naturally, I thought they were just full of crap. So I'm up there setting cocktail tables and stuff, and about halfway through I hear my supervisor's voice come from the kitchen area from behind some doors, just making casual conversation. We were pretty good friends, so he was asking me about a girl I told him I'd met the night before. We were talking for maybe 3 minutes before he suddenly stops and doesn't answer. When I ask if something happens or if he's alright, after getting no replies, I start to walk from the front of the room next to an elevator to the floor and make my way to the kitchen to see if he's alright. Once I made it to the middle of the room, I hear the elevator. There isn't supposed to be anyone else in our department working right now, and we're the only ones allowed on the floor. When the elevator stops and the doors open, my supervisor walks out and apologizes for taking so long to come up and help. I'm shocked and confused. I don't really know what to say. After a minute or two of being confused as hell, he asks me if I'm alright, and then I tell him what happened. I'm a pretty big skeptic, but he's a fully fledged believer and I'm terrified. He rushes to finish setting up for the party, and then instead of finishing the rest of the work we were supposed to that night, he tells me to go home, and he left shortly after. We're still unsure what happened, or what to make of it. I was flying out of Atlanta because my trip began at 4 a.m. Atlanta wasn't my first flight of the day, and I'd pulled an all-nighter and had been up for well over 24 hours by this point. I was looking forward to getting a few hours sleep on the plane, but the gods decided to spit on my plans. Approaching the jetway, my boarding pass scans, beeps once instead of twice, and a slip of paper comes out of the scanner. I have a new seat assignment. Cool. I get in my seat. There's barely any space left in the overhead, and I can't fit my carry-on up there. The attendant says that the bag will have to be left behind in Atlanta and shipped to me later on. Then a gentleman in the seat back speaks up and points out the space in another overhead. So everything's fine. I sit down, and in a few minutes or so, the plane begins to back away from the jetway. And at this precise moment, the guy across the aisle from me vomits explosively. 3 times. It hits him, the 2 people on either side of him, and the row in front of him for good measure. Everyone around freaks and starts spamming the call attendant buttons. They shout back that since the airplane has begun to taxi, nothing can be done until we've reached cruising altitude. The spamming continues, and finally one of the attendants decides to see what everyone is flipping out about. She walks back, gets one look and utters, "Oh my god." Across the aisle from this, myself at a window seat and the guy next to me just had our noses buried in the collars of our coats, trying not to throw up as well, as at this point the smell has wafted through the cabin and we can hear a chorus of other people beginning to retch and heave in response. There's nothing for it. The unfortunate puke brigade can't get out of their seats until we reach cruising, so the flight attendants, backed up by a second, try to do what they can until that point. Finally, once we reach cruising, all of them flee to the bathrooms and cleanup begins. Except at first, they can't find an air spray, so the first flight attendant begins spraying vanilla-scented perfume everywhere in an attempt to mask the smell of vomit, which did not improve matters. The next one found a can of Febreze, and she sprayed half the can in the affected area. People rapidly started complaining of headaches, and seatmate and myself are now completely unable to breathe. The first attendant has started biohazard cleanup at this point, sprinkling puke dust everywhere to contain the mess, since it can't be cleaned up fully mid-air. During this, the flight attendant catches on that the Febreze is killing everyone, so they go and get a bag of ground coffee beans, which finally remedies the situation. Until someone starts complaining about the smell of coffee. They bring the Febreze back, and me and my seatmate slowly start to die. We never saw the people who got puked on again, but we saw the puker once more when he came back to get something from his bag. Apparently he didn't have a change of clothes, so the attendants tied paper napkins all over his chest to the amusement of no one. Beverage services saw the purchase of a metric ton of alcohol, and the first attendant was later joking about burning her uniform. The great pukening was all anyone could talk about for the whole flight and deplaning. As soon as we landed, phones came out so that everyone could complain to their friends and relatives. No sleep was had on those 2 hours. I've had a few spooky ghost stories happen to me, but my 2 favorites are these. One happened and one started at the same night. When I was a teenager in Riverside, California, my older brother and his friends used to visit the local cemeteries at night to be spooky goth kids, often picking up broken stones and messes made by jerks along the way. This particular night, it was him, my mum and me, and I think 2 of his friends. There could have been 3. I was carrying my flip phone, which had no service, that I used as a clock, but its battery had drained earlier in the day, so it was off and useless. We were walking through an older area with upright gravestones, and I walked over to a grave when my phone rang, and it lit up as though someone was calling. I stopped and pulled it out of my pocket and looked, but there was no caller ID. I walked forward and showed my mum, and it stopped, went black again, and the call died. Okay, that was weird, but whatever. We tried to move a headstone that had been knocked over, but it was far too heavy for the 5 or 6 of us to move. When we started walking back the way we came, at what I think was the same area, it happened a second time. The second time everyone was together and saw it ring twice, light up and then turn off suddenly. That same night, when we were heading to the car, I had an urge to go to the newer side of the cemetery, so I did, as I felt oddly drawn to a specific stone. This area had only flat stones, all neatly lined in rows, and when I got there I realized it was a little boy's grave, maybe 5 years old. There were one of those small oval photos on the stone so that you could see him, and it was odd, because I had bought a Beanie Baby earlier that day and had it in my shirt. I felt drawn to leave it for him, so I did. From then on, occasionally I'd be out at the thrift store or whatever, and I'd occasionally see a toy or trinket and think, I should bring that to him. So I did for years, until I moved in 2009. I would visit the grave of a child I never knew because I saw a toy he might like. Not sure why, but to me that seemed perfectly normal at the time. When my stepdad was getting his pilot's license years ago, he was doing all kinds of tricks in a small aircraft, flying it up and down like a zigzag. Before one of the drops, my sister had taken her seatbelt off, unbeknownst to everyone else on the plane, because she dropped her Furby on the floor. The plane went down, she went up. Her head split and splurted blood everywhere and completely drenched me. We sat like that, drenched in her blood for hours, until we could have an emergency landing on a hospital roof in the middle of nowhere. We have photos from that day, standing on the wing with our Furbies in our hands, which is happy and creepy to look back on. I was staying at this huge house to watch a family friend's dog while they were out of town. The woman's husband died a few years back from cancer, and all of his stuff was stored in the guest room closet when I was sleeping. One night I was completely asleep, and I woke up to the sound of something falling. I flicked on the light and realized a movie had fallen out of the TV stand. That wouldn't be that weird, except the TV stand where the movies were stored had doors, and the doors had these latches that you'd have to pull decently hard to open. I decided to be brave and go figure out what happened, and when I picked the movie, I kid you not, it was Ghost. It was probably something between 12 to 3 a.m., but I got out of the house as fast as I could. Also, the dog wasn't in the room with me, as the door was closed and locked. I work at a business that designs and manufactures coffins, so not directly around death, but pretty damn close. Oftentimes we receive special requests from the deceased family to engrave messages or even images on the coffin. The most common by far is the birth date and death date, the dead person's name, and we even get requests to engrave their face on the coffin. It was about 5 years ago I got a call from someone who had recently ordered a generic wooden coffin. It doesn't matter how many of these calls I've had to take over the years, it's depressing every single time I have to listen to someone talk about their dead loved one. This woman was almost in tears from the second I picked up the phone, and I was certainly in tears by the end of it. She told me the story of her father who had flown Boeing planes throughout the Vietnam War and had gone to become a commercial pilot for Pan Am. Flying airplanes was his entire life. Finally, she told me about how her father had been hit by a sudden heart attack at the age of 74 after being as healthy as a horse his entire life. While lying on a hospital bed, almost waiting to die, he looked out the window and to his right whispered what turned out to be his last words. "Looks like a beautiful night to fly." The woman asked me to engrave those words on his coffin, and I cried for a while after that. As an adult, I haven't been the type to hype into all the "ooh, spooky ghost stuff." That being said, my friend's mother passed away, and we were at his family's place, doing what we could, being there however we could, friend stuff. He goes on talking about how he can feel her in the house. Sometimes he can hear or smell her. We just took it as intense grieving and denial, and decided to go along with it to help him cope. During the trip down the hallway, I caught the faintest whiff of a scent. It smelled familiar to what he described his mother wearing, but we brush it off. Hours later, after some drinking, I decide to tell him, since he was getting the feeling none of us were taking what he said seriously. He pulls me aside into a hallway and says she only shows up for family blah 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 and she trusts you. I trust you. We hug it out, he gets out some more crying and starts saying to her to leave a sign and to let me know he's serious. If the rest of the group can't take him seriously, at least I'm willing to. So give a sign. And nothing happens. Well, everyone did drink a lot, which meant, eventually, a lot of peeing. I go through the same hallway, and I feel and smell the same scent again, with a slight chill. The usual paranormal activity trope. In the restroom, I begin to take the world's best piss. Decorations you'd expect to find in the bathroom of family homes, towels, tiny soaps, a mirror, and a picture frame here and there. There's one of these oversized candles in front of me on top of the toilet tray thing. Well, that big fat candle decided to slide all the way from the center part of the toilet, all the way off and land perfectly upright in the mini wastebasket next to the toilet. I did not finish my piss. Later my friend told me, as he just had a knowing look, not even an "I told you so" look, but just like, yep, that's right. It was her. I was visiting a friend in Chicago, and she told me under no uncertain terms the ghost of a woman who lived there wasn't really fond of men staying there. I was told that I needed to make sure I closed the door behind me, lest she slam the door behind me. Sure as hell, the first night I'm there, I get up to pee in the middle of the night. I didn't close the bathroom door when I came back from the bathroom, and the door slammed so hard it knocked a piece of art off the damn wall. I was working on an airline, and one day there was smoke in the cockpit when we landed. Thankfully it was when I landed, and we had to push the airplane off the runway. We also almost had 2 mid-air collisions, one due to a new pilot not being where he should be, and another due to control telling me an aircraft was at my 11 o'clock, when in reality it was at my 2 o'clock. The coolest was a meteor that burned up directly in front of me, same altitude, straight ahead. I have no idea how far away it was, but it was bright and pretty, and went through a spectrum of colors as it burned. My friends and I went out to a cemetery that was quite popular in our college town, and I met one ghost called Lizzie that they had already met. She could sort of share her feelings with us, if that makes sense. When she was introducing herself to me, I started crying out of nowhere. That same night I was hugged by a 5 to 6-year-old boy named James. He was shy but just sitting on my knees in the field next to the cemetery, where he was playing, telling me about myself and how I wanted to be a teacher. I also told him if I could give him a hug, and as I stood up to leave, I felt what could have been 2 small arms wrapping around my legs. When we left, my friend blasted the train horn he had on his truck. I just got the feeling that James was following us a little ways away and was laughing happily because he liked the horn on the truck. I was only 6 to 8 years old, and I was on my way home after having lunch with my grandparents and mother. We share half of the same house, so I asked my mum if I could go back home. So I left and went inside my house, opened the door and walked a bit. When I reached the diner/living room, I saw a child about my size and same age, but looked completely different. White, like the old pictures that were in black and white. She used some kind of really old-looking dress, almost Victorian children's style. Her hair looked really curly in pigtails. I stared at the kid, feeling like I was watching something that really shouldn't or wasn't there. After I saw her, I took off running to the other side of the house where my grandparents and mother were. I remember that I was crying to them about some random kid in the house, and the kid looked like she had some old and glowing white skin complexion. My mum never really believed me, until she recalled that when we moved into the house, I told her that some kid always looked at me from under my bedroom door. So she said to just ask what she wants, and I told her that the kid told me that she wanted to protect me. There's always the explanation of an overactive imagination, but I don't recall that ever happening, and remember these events quite vividly. My boyfriend and I were in our house eating dinner. Our front door was open and the screen door was closed. We heard the screen door open and slam shut. We both went to the living room and out onto the front porch. As soon as we went out, we were hit by a thick, cloying, floral sweet smell. It smelled like funeral flowers, if you've ever smelled that scent before, just overwhelmingly strong and concentrated right in front of our house. We both felt kind of creeped out, so we went back into the house and into our bedroom. I sat on the edge of our bed, which faced the hallway, and one of our dogs came and hopped onto my lap. My boyfriend and I were speculating about what the door slamming and the smell was all about. I was looking straight ahead into the hall during a lull in the conversation, and I saw a dark shadow pass down the hall, go past our bedroom door, and into another room at the end of the hall. It was just tall, vaguely human-shaped and solid black, like the area it was in, just had all the light sucked from it, and you couldn't see through it. Our dog saw it too. He went nuts, barking and growling and whining. For some reason, that scared me more than anything, that he saw it too. I started crying and said I wanted to leave the house, so we got our dogs into our car and left. We were having plumbing problems anyway, so we ended up just staying in a hotel room that night. When we came back the next day, things seemed totally normal, and nothing like that happened since. It's definitely been one of the spookiest things I've ever experienced. I rented what used to be the master bedroom of a house built around 1970. The current owners made it into a studio with an attached bath and mini kitchen. I lived there for a year on my own before my husband moved in once we were married. Nothing ever happened, but on our wedding day when I woke up, I found a plant that I'd had for many years had somehow flown off my bookshelf and apparently committed suicide in the middle of my floor. There were no earthquakes here, nothing had moved, and it was very strange. Okay, so he moves in and weird stuff starts happening. Like the TV will begin turning on and off by itself. A strong smell of cigarette smoke starts to appear when I'm alone, despite the windows being closed and fans blowing in my face. My husband made a canvas print of one of our wedding pictures, and it kept flying off the wall. I had a tabletop fan that was sitting 6 feet between both my husband and I. I didn't move or shake it, and it was my husband that turned it around to point it at him, as he was quite hot and I was studying with flashcards and didn't want them blowing away. 30 seconds later, I feel the wind blow on me. So I look up and say, "Babe, I thought you were hot and wanted the fan." "I did." "Well, why is it pointing at me then?" We both got the same wide-eyed look and realized that the fan had spun 180 degrees in less than a minute by itself. It was creepy, but none of this ever felt dangerous. More like it was a man who was annoyed that my husband had moved in. I guess the ghost wanted me all to himself. We lived across the street from one of the oldest cemeteries in Southern California. It was just strange little things. We thought that maybe it was the owner's remote controls turning off our TV at one point, but then we figured out that their TV was in the opposite direction of ours, and a different brand, so yeah. A house I grew up in as a kid. The previous owners that died were an older woman with a piano. There were several times I'd wake up to a piano playing. I'd walk around the house and everything would be off and everyone asleep. She seemed to really like playing Moonlight Sonata. When I was 15, in honors chorus, I was about to go on stage and sing in front of an auditorium full of people. We were all backstage warming up, and another teenager starts playing Moonlight Sonata on piano. It's at that point I almost crapped myself. I still did my solo, but hearing that really unnerved me for days. At that point it had been a 10-year gap since hearing the song. My parents were not into classical piano, so an auditory hallucination would have been almost impossible. It happened on and off for almost a year, and it was different songs, but Moonlight Sonata was certainly the most frequently played. Whenever me and my siblings are home alone downstairs, we hear footsteps pacing back and forth up the stairs. Whenever we go on our stairway, the footsteps stop abruptly. Also, sometimes when we get home from vacation to find one or two of our windows open, as we live in a safe neighborhood, this isn't really a problem, but my mom is convinced that it's the work of ghosts, because we would obviously never leave our windows open before going on road trips. Our attic is far too small and dangerous for a stowaway. Plus, the only entrance to it is in my mum's closet, which has boxes and stuff, and is impenetrable to get through without making a ton of noise or being extremely obvious. We also have 4 cats and dogs, so no human or vermin are running around in our house undetected. The footsteps are loud stomps that pace back and forth and aren't human, but stop abruptly when I reach the stairs. It's not like something scuttles away and hides. It simply stops. I was in a burial site on a tour. The area was large and empty, in a field. I was standing quietly looking around when I heard something whispering in my ear. Then it moved to my other ear. I wish I could tell you what. It was a set of breathy, whispered syllables that rushed back and forth with a staticky element between my ears. Being that this was a potter's field of mental institution patients from the 1800s, it makes me wonder what the spirit was trying to convey. The whispering swiped back and forth almost like a train barreling down the tracks, but just between my ears. It was definitely a woman. I seriously couldn't make out the words, and I tried to shake my head of it until I noticed that the person near me had a look on their face that made me realize he heard exactly what I had too. We looked at one another wide-eyed and exchanged the exact same account of what had happened. Maybe if I'd have experienced this by myself, I would have come up with an excuse. But as it was also confirmed by another person, I knew it was real. I know exactly who in my family is walking around based on their footsteps. But one night, pretty late, I heard someone walking down the hallway outside my bedroom with slow, heavy footsteps that definitely didn't belong to anyone in my household. Of course, no one was there. I heard this for the next few nights, and there was a couple of months break before I heard it again, and then nothing for ages. Myself and my younger brother were the only ones who had heard creepy footsteps. Recently, everyone but my dad went away for the weekend, and the first night he had to get up with a baseball bat because he thought someone had broken into the house and was creeping down the hallway, but once again no one was there. It only happened in the hallway for some reason. Starts at the end of the hall and stops at the end. My office was in the basement of a building next to an 150-year-old cemetery. The job involved handling old historic materials. On several occasions, my co-workers and I experienced unexplainable phenomena. Co-workers saw the air rippling behind my desk. Another co-worker quit after seeing a shadowy figure stalk them at night when nobody else should have been in the building. Objects have moved on their own. And once, 2 people swear they saw a pen levitating in the air for a split second. I was skeptical until late one night. I was leaving, and just a step behind the other person who was in the office. Suddenly I see a foggy apparition about 5 or 6 feet, standing about 30 to 40 feet in front of me. It had had a rough outline of a human. The air had turned unbearably cold, and the hair on my neck went straight up, and just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. Later that night, several terrible events happened around me and to loved ones, and I knew, whatever it was not happy that I saw it. We have a ghost at work. We've never named him, but my co-workers and I all agree he's an older guy between the age of 60 to 70. He does things like move small items the kids wouldn't be able to reach, like on a waist-high counter. Call your name quietly, and a few times we've heard a cry or seen a child-sized figure run past when everyone is in the garden asleep or in their eyesight. I say hello in the morning when I get in. He seems pretty harmless and kind of protective over the children. Can't hurt to be polite though, right? I encountered the ghost of a little girl once. She was in my parents' old house, which is where I grew up as a teenager. I heard a clear voice wake me up from my sleep a few times saying, "Hello?" I was never afraid, and I've never thought much about it until it happened a few times. Then one night, she laughed 2 distinct syllables. Heh. I felt bad for her, honestly. Both my ghost and yours. Imagine being a kid, trapped on the other side of a place you know, unable to do anything about it. You're alone. No one can meaningfully interact with you. And worst of all, are all the other things that occasionally wander this side of reality with you. It's got to be terrifying. When I was in college and studying at home, I remember needing to find a particularly old 17th century play called The Alchemist by Ben Jonson. Me being poor and stupid, I didn't buy the class textbook, so I had to find it on my own. I was at my desk, and behind me was a walk-in closet, which I used as a library, as I collected old and rare books. I remember thinking that I saw the play in an old anthology of literature that I owned, and quickly pushed that out of my mind, as I thought it would take too much effort for a text that was surely available on Project Gutenberg online. I hear a loud thump behind me, and turn around in my chair and walk into the closet, and on the floor was a book turned open, with the pages facing up. You have to understand this part for it to truly sink in, that my closet was lined with shelves that extended far enough back that no part of my books were hanging over the edge. I was meticulous and very careful with them, as some were relics. I looked at the book in disbelief, and when I saw that it was the anthology of literature I was thinking of, and not only that, but the header of the page showed it was a page of the play The Alchemist, I knew this was something truly out of the ordinary and unexplainable. I have more experiences in this house, but one thing will remain with me as irrefutable proof that something intelligent understood my inner thoughts and caused that to happen. In the same house, on the day my father died, my grandma also tells a story of how pictures in the house were flying off the walls at her. My dad hated her guts, and she's always been an honest person. I don't know if I'd call what happened to me an experience with a ghost per se, but I thought it would be worth mentioning. I was around 15 to 16 in the middle of the day, and I saw a guy crossing the street in a sprint, and a school bus ran him over and never stopped. It was like I was the only one who says the bus ran over the man, and when I looked back, to my horror, there was nothing on the floor. The bus driver didn't even attempt to stop as the man sprinting across the street for the bus ran him over, like there was nothing on the road and kept on going. I was in the back seat behind my mum. While she was driving, I asked her if she saw the bus run over the man, and she said she didn't see any man. I'm 18 now, and still can't explain what I saw that day, and it was then that I began to believe in ghosts. This happened in 2011. Me and my older brother were playing hide and seek, and my old house had a very long hallway that had rooms to a laundry room, a bathroom, and me and my brother's bedrooms. Anyway, we were playing and I looked into the hallway, and all the way back into the laundry room I saw half of a dark figure with long black hair and face paint. And as soon as it turned to look at me, it slowly went back into the laundry room, and so I investigated and saw nothing in there. My dad believes our house was haunted by Native Americans because the land we live on was close to a reservation. Plus, my dad and older brother also experienced paranormal stuff as well. Like one time, my grandma was sleeping in our house when she woke up and saw a hand floating, reaching for her, and she yelled out, "El Diablo!" or something like that. But my uncle told me that she believed that she was connected to the other world. My uncle also told me that our old house gave him a weird feeling. Also, we moved from that house in 2014, but in June of 2021, I went to the bathroom to wash my hands, and right when I was about to put soap on my arm, I looked as I felt a burning sensation, and I saw 3 scratch marks that were red slowly appear from nothing. I freaked out and told my sister. Every month, on the 5th, since I moved into this house, I always hear someone screaming, "Let me in a distorted voice outside my door. I've lived here for 5 years. I know these patterns. It manifests every 5th of the month. When it appears, you can smell it before you hear it, since it smells like smoke, garlic, and at first, I thought the stove was on, and it was burning. But in my exhaustion, told myself it was a fire, and I bought my deer killer just in case. And when I was about to open the door, I hear banging and screaming and a man saying, "Let me in." And that's when I jumped to my senses and found my compact ladder and hopped out the window. This persisted for a while, and it always stays in the range of 11-12 p.m. to 4 a.m. This happened for 3 months, and I thought a psycho was in my house, and I had it searched multiple times by the police. Me and my boys, the police, found nothing. So I installed a security system, and once again, when I reviewed the footage, it had been like it had never been recorded. It skipped the second it started. I wish I knew what was going on here. I found an old headstone on our property as a kid. That same night, I saw 2 ladies watching me through our family room window. We locked eyes, and as we did so, they turned into mist and were gone. I wasn't immediately scared either, like they were good spirits and I knew it. But it still creeps me out to this day, though.